The blizzard came early that December, as if winter itself had grown impatient with autumn's lingering warmth. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, blanketing the Montana wilderness in silent white. Inside the small cabin perched on Pine Ridge, the fire crackled and hissed, casting long shadows across rough-hewn walls. Grace Sullivan gripped the edge of the bed, her knuckles white face contorted in pain. Another contraction tore through her body, and she bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. The taste of copper filled her mouth. "Breathe." Jackson Reed's voice came steady but strained. "Just like I showed you." He moved with practiced efficiency, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they arranged clean linens beneath her. The sleeves of his cotton shirt were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked by old scars. A sheen of sweat glistened on his brow despite the December chill. Grace sucked in a ragged breath, her eyes finding his. "You promised," she gasped between contractions. "You promised you wouldn't let me go like Sarah." Something flickered across Jackson's face, pain, remembrance, fear gone as quickly as it appeared. He nodded once, jaw set with determination. "I won't fail. Not this time." Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the cabin's windows. The storm had sealed them off from the world, from help, from escape. There was only this moment in this room, these two people bound by circumstance and an unspoken promise. Jackson's hands trembled slightly as he checked Grace's progress. Too early. The baby wasn't meant to come for another month. He reached for the medical bag he'd prepared weeks ago, instruments laid out with military precision. "The baby's coming fast," he said, voice low and controlled. "I need you to be strong now." Grace's eyes, amber in the firelight, locked onto his. For a moment, neither spoke. In that silence lay months of shared solitude, of slow building trust, of wounds slowly healing. "I am strong," she whispered. Then another contraction hit, and her world narrowed to pain and pressure, and the desperate need to bring her child safely into the world. As Grace labored through the night outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks, covering secrets, offering the clean slate of a new beginning. 3 months earlier, the White Ridge station wasn't much to look at, a weather-beaten platform, a small office with smoke curling from its chimney, and a single bench where Grace Sullivan sat alone. Her valise rested by her feet, her woolen coat pulled tight around her middle, though it did little to disguise the curve of her belly. 6 months pregnant and abandoned. Again. The late September wind cut through her clothing, carrying the first hint of the winter to come. Grace didn't cry. She had spent her tears in private places, in the dark corners of rented rooms in the still hours before dawn. Now she simply waited, though, for what she wasn't entirely sure. Edward Fleming had been charming, handsome, full of stories about gold in the Montana hills, and promises of a new life together. He'd taken her hand in his, sworn he'd care for her, always looked at her as though she were precious. For a woman of 38 with the past she was desperate to escape his attention had been intoxicating. Until the moment his hand had brushed against the swell of her stomach on the train, and his expression had shifted from confusion to calculation to cold dismissal. 38 and breeding. He'd laughed, the sound brittle as frozen twigs. "You should have told me, Grace." Then he was gone, stepping off at White Ridge, with her trunk leaving her with only the clothes she wore and the small valise she'd kept at her side. He hadn't even looked back. The station master, a thin man with rheumy eyes, had regarded her with something between pity and suspicion before retreating to his office. The last train had departed hours ago. Night was falling, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. Grace pulled a worn leather pouch from her coat pocket, fingers finding comfort in the familiar objects inside: thimbles, needles, a small pair of silver scissors that had belonged to her mother. At the bottom lay a folded piece of unfinished embroidery, wildflowers half completed around the words, "Freedom Comes." The rest remained unstitched, her mother's final work left undone when death had taken her 5 years ago. An emancipated slave who had built a life from nothing, Esther Sullivan had taught her daughter two things: how to sew with precision that rich white ladies would pay handsomely for, and how to endure when the world offered nothing but cruelty. Grace ran her thumb over the embroidery, drawing strength from the connection to her mother. She would not break. Not again. Not after surviving Charles. The thought of her husband sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Charles Porter, respected Philadelphia politician, pillar of society, and behind closed doors, a monster whose rage left bruises in places her high neck dresses could hide. The kind of man who smiled for photographs while his fingernails dug crescents into her arm. Grace had planned her escape meticulously, waiting until Charles left for a 2-month campaign tour before disappearing. She hadn't planned on discovering her pregnancy weeks later. Hadn't planned on meeting Edward. Hadn't planned on ending up alone at a desolate train station in Montana with night falling and nowhere to go. The crunch of boots on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. A tall figure emerged from the gathering darkness, moving with the careful, measured steps of someone accustomed to harsh terrain. His face was mostly hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat, a thick beard covering his jaw. He carried a rifle in one hand, a leather satchel in the other. Grace straightened her spine, one hand moving protectively to her middle, the other tightening around the handle of her valise. She had learned the hard way to be wary of men who appeared from shadows. He stopped several paces away, regarding her silently. In the dim light from the station house window, she could make out eyes the color of steel set in a weathered face. "Station's closing," he said, voice rough as if unused to speaking. "Storm coming." Not a threat, just a statement of fact. Still, Grace didn't move. "I'm aware," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the cold that had settled into her bones. The man shifted his gaze, moving from her face to her rounded middle, then back again. No judgment in his look, just assessment. "You waiting for someone?" A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. "No," she said simply. "Not anymore." He nodded once, seeming to understand more than she'd said. He glanced at the darkening sky where heavy clouds promised snow by morning. "Name's Jackson Reed," he said after a long silence. "Got a cabin up on Pine Ridge. It's warm. Got food." Grace studied him, searching for the trap in his words, the hidden cost of such an offer. She'd learned that men rarely gave without expecting something in return. "Why would you help me?" she asked directly. His shoulders rose and fell in a slight shrug. "Nobody should die of cold when there's shelter to be had." Die of cold. The words hung between them, stark and honest. That was the reality she faced if she remained at the station through the night. Her hand moved again to her belly, feeling the slight flutter of movement beneath her palm. The station door opened, and the thin station master peered out. "Mr. Reed," he called, "got your medicine order. Best get back before the weather turns." Jackson raised a hand in acknowledgement, but kept his eyes on Grace. "I don't need charity," she said quietly. "Didn't offer any," he replied. "Just shelter and a meal." Grace weighed her options, which were painfully few. Stay and risk freezing, or go with this stranger who might be dangerous in ways she couldn't yet see. But something in his steady gaze and the careful distance he maintained suggested he understood boundaries. And she had her small knife tucked in her boot, a precaution she'd taken to carrying during her marriage. "All right," she said, finally rising to her feet with as much dignity as her aching back allowed. Jackson nodded once, then turned toward the station master to collect his package. Grace gathered her valise, arranging her scarf more securely around her neck. When Jackson returned, he didn't offer to take her bag, seeming to understand she needed to keep her possessions close. "It's an hour's ride," he said, leading her toward a sturdy wagon hitched to a patient-looking mule. "Road gets rough." They traveled in silence as darkness fell completely. The wagon jostled over the uneven trail, each bump sending a jolt of discomfort through Grace's tired body. She gripped the wooden seat, focusing on the rhythm of the mule's steady gait rather than the pain in her lower back or the hunger gnawing at her stomach. Jackson kept his eyes on the trail, occasionally glancing at the sky, where the first few snowflakes had begun to fall. His profile in the gathering darkness was sharp, unreadable. Not once did he attempt small talk or ask the questions that surely lingered: who she was, why she was alone, whose child she carried. The silence between them was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It simply was. The trail began to climb, winding through dense pine forest. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. Grace pulled her coat tighter, suppressing a shiver. Without a word, Jackson reached behind the seat and pulled out a thick woolen blanket, offering it to her, without taking his eyes from the trail. Grace hesitated only a moment before accepting, wrapping it around her shoulders, grateful for its weight and warmth. Finally, the wagon crested a ridge, and a small cabin came into view. It stood alone against the night sky, a single window glowing with lamplight. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, disappearing into the darkness. Simple, solid, isolated. Jackson brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake before climbing down. This time he did offer his hand to help Grace descend, his grip firm, but not controlling, released the moment her feet touched the ground. "Watch your step," he said, lifting a lantern to illuminate the path to the cabin door. "Gets icy here." The cabin's interior was surprisingly orderly. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the single room. A table and two chairs stood in the center, a narrow bed tucked against one wall. Shelves lined another wall filled with books, drawers and containers arranged with precise care. A desk in the corner held papers and what looked like medical instruments. "You're a doctor," Grace asked, the first question she'd posed since agreeing to come. Jackson set down his rifle and satchel, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. "Was," he replied, moving to stoke the fire. "Not anymore." Grace remained near the door, still wrapped in the blanket, assessing her surroundings. The cabin was clean, well-maintained. No signs of squalor or neglect that might suggest dangerous habits. No empty bottles, no evidence of vices. Jackson gestured to a chair by the fire. "Sit, you're cold." It wasn't a command, but an observation. Grace moved to the chair, grateful to be off her feet. The warmth of the fire began to seep into her bones, making her realize just how cold she had been. "Hungry?" he asked, moving to a small kitchen area. "Yes," she admitted. No point in false pride when her stomach might betray her with an audible growl at any moment. Jackson nodded and set about preparing a simple meal, beans, dried meat reconstituted in a savory broth, and cornbread that he warmed by the fire. He worked methodically, his movements economical, like a man accustomed to caring for himself. When he set the food before her, it was without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. Grace ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching as Jackson took his own meal to the desk, rather than joining her at the table. He gave her space, privacy in their shared confinement. As she ate, her gaze wandered the cabin, taking in details. A shelf near the bed held a few personal items, a carved wooden box, a tarnished pocket watch, a small framed photograph she couldn't make out from where she sat. Beside it, a leather-bound book that looked like a journal, its spine cracked from frequent use. On the opposite wall hung drying herbs and what appeared to be medical supplies, clean bandages, bottles of tinctures, instruments kept in meticulous order. This was the home of a man who valued precision and control. "You can take the bed," Jackson said, burrowing amongst the long silence. "I'll sleep by the fire." Grace set down her spoon, meeting his gaze directly. "Why are you helping me?" Jackson considered her question, his expression unreadable. "Told you, nobody should freeze when there's shelter." "And tomorrow," she pressed. "Tomorrow's not here yet," he replied simply. "Storm's coming. Roads will be bad for a few days. After that," he shrugged. "Your choice." Grace studied him, trying to discern his motivations. Men in her experience always wanted something. Charles had wanted control. Edward had wanted her savings and her body without the complication of her pregnancy. "I won't be a burden," she said firmly. "I can cook clean men clothing." Jackson nodded, accepting her need to establish terms. "Fair enough." After dinner, he showed her where to find water for washing a screen she could use for privacy, clean linens for the bed. His movements were careful, deliberate, maintaining distance without making it obvious he was doing so. As Grace prepared for sleep, exhaustion weighing her limbs, she noticed Jackson taking a book from the shelf and settling in the chair by the fire, angling the lamp to read. The cabin fell into silence, broken only by the occasional turn of a page or pop from the fire. She slipped beneath the blankets, her body grateful for the softness of a real bed after days of uncomfortable travel. The pillowcase smelled of pine and wood smoke, clean but unfamiliar. She kept her small knife within reach, a habit too ingrained to break even in this strange truce. Just before sleep claimed her, Grace's gaze fell on the photograph she could now see from the bed. A woman with dark hair and serious eyes stood beside a young girl, perhaps 5 or 6, with the same somber expression. Both wore the formal, stiff poses common in photographs, yet there was something in the way the woman's hand rested on the child's shoulder that spoke of tenderness. Beside the photograph lay the journal she'd noticed earlier. Its cover was worn smooth from handling its pages marked with slips of paper. The title, embossed in fading gold letters, read, "Advances in Obstetrical Medicine." Grace's hand moved to her belly as understanding dawned. The former doctor, the book's subject, the photo of a woman and child no longer present. Pieces began to form a picture, one she recognized all too well: loss. This man knew grief as intimately as she knew fear. With that realization came not comfort exactly, but a certain easing of tension. Jackson Reed had demons of his own. He wasn't looking to create new ones by harming her. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to relax for the first time in months. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first real snow of winter, covering tracks and erasing the path that had led her here to this strange sanctuary in the wilderness. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of movement. She remained still for a moment, orienting herself to unfamiliar surroundings, the events of the previous day returning in stages. Jackson stood at the stove, his back to her, preparing what smelled like oatmeal. He'd already dressed for the day, his movements suggesting he'd been awake for some time. Outside, snow fell steadily, transforming the world into shades of white and gray. Grace rose quietly, smoothing her rumpled dress as best she could, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance. She'd slept in her clothes, unwilling to unpack her few possessions in what might be only temporary lodging. Jackson turned at the sound of her movement, acknowledging her with a slight nod. "Coffee's hot," he said, gesturing to a pot on the stove. "Breakfast soon." "Thank you," she replied, moving to pour herself a cup. The warmth of the mug between her palms was welcome, the rich aroma, a small luxury she hadn't expected. They ate in the same silence that had characterized their interaction thus far, but it felt less strained in the light of day. Through the window, Grace could now see the full extent of the cabin's isolation. Pine-covered hills stretched in all directions, the nearest sign of other human habitation, a thin column of smoke rising from what must be the town miles away. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Jackson looked up from his bowl, seeming to weigh whether to answer. 5 years, he said after a moment. "Alone?" A shadow crossed his face. "Yes." Grace nodded, not pressing further. She understood boundaries, the need for privacy around certain wounds. After breakfast, Jackson pulled on his coat and hat. "Need to check the animals, bring in more wood," he explained. "Storm's getting worse. Might be snowed in for a few days." Once he'd gone, Grace took the opportunity to explore the cabin more thoroughly. The single room was roughly 20 feet square, every inch of space utilized with practical efficiency. The kitchen area consisted of the iron stove, a pump for water, and shelves holding basic provisions. A small workbench beneath the window served as both dining table and desk. On the opposite side, a trunk at the foot of the bed likely contained clothing and personal items. Above it, the shelf she'd noticed the night before held not only the photograph and journal, but also a collection of small, carved wooden animals. A deer, a bear, and eagle, each rendered with surprising artistry. Her attention returned to the medical text. Carefully, she lifted it from the shelf, noting how it fell open naturally to a heavily annotated section on puerperal fever, childbed fever. The margins were filled with notes in a precise slanting script, some passages underlined heavily, others marked with question marks or cross-references to other texts. A loose paper slipped from between the pages, falling to the floor. Grace bent awkwardly to retrieve it, her pregnancy making the movement cumbersome. It was a letter, the paper creased and worn as if read many times to read. "The Board of Medical Directors regrets to inform you that your request for reinstatement has been denied. While we acknowledge your distinguished service as a military surgeon and your previous contributions to Boston Medical College, the circumstances surrounding the deaths of multiple patients under your care during the fever outbreak of 1880, including that of your wife Sarah Reed, render your return to practice inadvisable. Your research proposals regarding antiseptic practices in obstetrical medicine have been forwarded to the appropriate committee, though we must caution that your theories regarding hand washing and instrument sterilization as preventative measures remain controversial at best. We suggest you consider retirement from medical practice as the most honorable course. The loss of your wife and daughter was indeed tragic, but your continued insistence that your colleagues' practices were responsible reflects poorly on the profession. Respectfully, Dr. William Harrison, Chairman, Board of Medical Directors, Boston Medical College." Grace carefully refolded the letter, her heart beating faster. The pieces fit together now. The medical texts, the careful notes, the absent family, the self-imposed exile. Jackson Reed had lost everything: his family, his profession, his reputation, and had retreated to this remote place to nurse his wounds. She returned the letter to the book and placed it exactly as she'd found it, unsettled by this glimpse into her host's private pain. It felt like trespassing, yet it also offered context she needed. This man was not dangerous in the way she had feared, but he carried wounds that had never properly healed. The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air, and Jackson himself, arms laden with firewood. Grace moved quickly away from the shelf, busying herself with washing the breakfast dishes. If Jackson noticed her discomfort, he gave no sign. He stacked the wood beside the hearth, shook the snow from his coat, and hung it by the door. "Storm's getting worse," he said, moving to the stove to warm his hands. "Might last a few days." Grace nodded, uncertain what this meant for her immediate future. "Is there anything I can do to help? With chores, I mean?" Jackson seemed to consider this, his eyes taking in her pregnant state, assessing limitations. "Could use some mending if you're offering," he said finally. "Got shirts need patching." It was a kindness she realized, giving her a way to contribute that used her skills without taxing her physically. "I'd be glad to," she replied. "It's my trade, actually. I was a seamstress in Philadelphia." He nodded, moving to the trunk at the foot of the bed and extracting several worn shirts with tears at the elbows and seams. "Thread and needles in that box," he said, indicating a small wooden container on the shelf. Grace settled herself in the chair by the fire, grateful for the warmth and the familiar comfort of work. The sewing box contained quality materials: steel needles, strong thread, sharp scissors. She selected what she needed and began the methodical work of mending. Jackson returned to his desk, where he pulled out what appeared to be a logbook and began making entries. The scratch of his pen and the crackle of the fire created a soothing backdrop to the silent industry that filled the afternoon. As she worked, Grace allowed herself to consider her situation more fully. She was effectively stranded, at least until the storm passed. Even then, her options were limited. She had little money, no connections in this territory, and her advancing pregnancy would soon make travel difficult, if not impossible. Charles would be looking for her by now. He would have returned from his campaign tour to find her gone, and his rage would be terrible. He had resources, connections. If he discovered she was carrying his child, his determination to find her would only intensify. A male heir would secure his political legacy, something he had spoken of often. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. She looked up to find Jackson watching her, his expression unreadable. "You're afraid," he said simply. It wasn't a question, but Grace felt compelled to answer anyway. "Yes," he nodded, as if her admission confirmed something he had already suspected. Of what's coming or what's behind? The directness of the question startled her. "Both," she admitted after a moment. Jackson's gaze was steady, assessing, but not intrusive. "The man who left you at the station—" "One of them," she replied, her needle continuing its steady rhythm through the fabric. "And the other," Grace's hand stilled. "My husband." Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, understanding perhaps, or recognition of a familiar darkness. "He looking for you?" "Yes." The word came out, barely above a whisper. Jackson nodded once, returning his attention to his logbook. "Hard to find someone in these mountains," he said after a moment, "especially in winter." It wasn't an offer of protection, not exactly. But in his matter-of-fact assessment, Grace felt the first tendrils of hope take root. Perhaps here, in this remote place with this taciturn man, she could disappear long enough to deliver her child safely, to make a plan for their future. "I can stay until the baby comes," she asked, the question hanging between them. Jackson looked up, his expression somber. "Cabin's warm. Got food enough. Your choice." It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was permission. Grace nodded, returning to her mending with renewed focus. "Thank you." The afternoon wore on, the storm intensifying outside. Jackson eventually rose and prepared a simple dinner: venison stew that had been simmering at the back of the stove, cornbread warmed by the fire. They ate together at the small table, the silence between them now more companionable than strained. After dinner, Jackson surprised her by retrieving a checkerboard from a shelf and setting it on the table. "Used to play," he said by way of explanation. "If you'd like." Grace found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like months. "I would," she replied. They played 2 games, neither speaking much beyond the necessities of the game itself. Grace won the first, Jackson the second. As he put the board away, Grace noticed the hint of what might have been a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That night, as she settled into bed, Grace felt a cautious sense of peace. Outside, the storm howled, sealing them in their unlikely sanctuary. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting a warm glow over the cabin, where 2 damaged people had found, if not connection, then at least a momentary ceasefire in their respective battles. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the child within stir. "We're safe for now," she whispered, too low for Jackson to hear from his place by the fire. And that's enough to start with. Days stretched into weeks, and slowly a routine emerged. Jackson rose before dawn, tended to the animals, a mule, 2 goats, and a small flock of chickens, housed in a sturdy lean-to behind the cabin, and brought in firewood. Grace prepared breakfast, then spent her mornings cleaning or mending, while Jackson worked at his desk or ventured out to check traps he'd set in the surrounding forest. Afternoons were for quiet industry, Jackson whittling new wooden figures or maintaining his tools, Grace working on an old quilt she'd found in the trunk, patching it with scraps of fabric Jackson had said she was welcome to use. Evenings brought shared meals, occasional games of checkers, and the companionable silence of two people reading by firelight. They spoke little of their past, though pieces emerged in fragments. Jackson had served as a surgeon during the war, had practiced in Boston afterward. Grace had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a freed slave who had built a reputation as a skilled seamstress. Neither mentioned the wounds that had driven them to this remote place, but understanding grew between them nonetheless. The first real change came 3 weeks after Grace's arrival. She had been airing blankets on the march, taking advantage of a rare sunny day, when she spotted a figure approaching on horseback. Her heart raced. Had Charles found her already? But Jackson, chopping wood nearby, seemed unconcerned. "Margaret," he explained, setting down his axe, "comes by sometimes. She's the midwife from town." The woman who dismounted was older than Grace had expected, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She carried a basket covered with a cloth and moved with the confident stride of someone half her age. "Jackson," she greeted with a nod, then turned her penetrating gaze to Grace. "And you must be the young woman Tommy at the station mentioned." Grace straightened her spine, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "Grace Sullivan." She introduced herself, deliberately using her mother's surname rather than her husband's. Margaret's eyes moved to Grace's swollen belly, then back to her face assessment, clear in her expression. "Margaret Fletcher," she replied. "I bring supplies from town, tend to what doctoring needs doing around these parts." She handed the basket to Jackson. "Brought your medicines, some mail, and news." Jackson accepted the basket with a nod of thanks, then gestured to the cabin. "Come in out of the cold." Inside, Margaret settled at the table with the ease of someone familiar with the space. Jackson poured coffee while Grace set out the cornbread she'd baked that morning. "So," Margaret said once they were seated, her gaze direct, "how far along are you?" "About 6 months," Grace replied. "The baby should come in early December." Margaret nodded. "Mind if I examine? You've been delivering babies in this territory for 40 years. Like to know what I'm walking into." Grace hesitated, glancing at Jackson, who had moved to the far side of the cabin to sort through the contents of Margaret's basket. "He's a doctor," Margaret said, following her gaze. "Or was, but I understand if you'd prefer privacy." "No," Grace said after a moment. "It's fine." She had read enough in Jackson's medical books to know that male doctors regularly attended births in cities, though midwives were more common in rural areas. Jackson glanced up. "I'll check the animals," he said, reaching for his coat. Once he'd gone, Margaret's examination was brisk but thorough. Her hands, though gnarled with age, were gentle as they palpated Grace's abdomen, checking the baby's position. "Healthy size," she commented. "Strong heartbeat." She helped Grace readjust her clothing. "You've been taking care of yourself, eating well." "Yes," Grace replied. "Jackson makes sure of it." Something like approval flickered across Margaret's weathered face. "Good, he knows what's needed even if he doesn't practice anymore." She settled back in her chair, studying Grace. "So what brings a city woman to White Ridge alone and in your condition?" The directness of the question caught Grace off guard. She considered deflecting, but recognized that in this isolated place, trust might be necessary for survival. "I was running from my husband," she admitted. "He's not a kind man." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "Rarely are, in my experience." She sipped her coffee. "Does he know about the child?" "No," Grace replied. "I didn't know myself when I left. I met a man on the train, Edward Fleming. He promised a new start. Then he discovered I was pregnant and abandoned me at the station." "Men," Margaret said with a snort of disgust, "always making promises their character can't cash." She set down her cup, fixing Grace with a penetrating look. And Jackson, how does he fit into your plans? He doesn't, Grace said quickly. He offered shelter when I had nowhere else to go. I'm grateful, but I don't expect anything more. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Jackson's a good man, she said finally. Broken, but good. Lost his wife and daughter to childbed fever 5 years ago. Couldn't save them, though God knows he tried. Grace's hand moved instinctively to her belly. I know, she said softly. I saw the photograph. And his medical books. Still studies, Margaret confirmed. Believes doctors are killing women by not washing their hands between patients. Got him laughed out of Boston, but he's right. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. I've been delivering babies since before the war. Started washing my hands with lye soap after every birth when my own daughter died of fever. Haven't lost a mother to infection since. The door opened, admitting Jackson and a gust of cold air. He stamped his boots clean of mud before entering, his gaze moving between the two women, assessing. Everything all right? He asked, his question directed at neither of them in particular. Mother and child are healthy, Marguerite reported, but she'll need watching as the time gets closer. First babies can be troublesome. Jackson nodded, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. I'll keep an eye. Margaret rose, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. I should get back before dark. Roads are getting worse with the weather. She turned to Grace. I'll come by again in a few weeks, see how you're progressing. As Jackson walked Margaret to her horse, Grace remained by the window watching their interaction. Though she couldn't hear their words, there was an ease between them that suggested long acquaintance and mutual respect. When Jackson returned, he moved to the basket Margaret had brought, unpacking jars of medicine, letters, and a small package wrapped in brown paper. She's direct, Grace commented. Jackson's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Margaret doesn't believe in wasting words. She told me about your wife and daughter, Grace said after a moment. I'm sorry. Jackson's hand stilled his back to her. For a long moment, he didn't speak. When he finally turned, his expression was carefully controlled. Sarah, he said, the name sounding rough, as if rarely spoken aloud. And Emma. He cleared his throat. Fever took them 5 days after Emma was born. Grace recognized the cost of each word, the effort it took to release them into the air. You tried to save them. It wasn't a question, but Jackson nodded once his gaze fixed on some middle distance. Wasn't enough. The simplicity of the statement contained volumes of grief, guilt, rage, emotions Grace recognized all too well. She didn't offer platitudes or reassurances. There were none that wouldn't sound hollow. Instead, she said, that's why you study, to understand what happened. To prevent it happening again, he corrected, his voice low but intense. Doctors are killing women with dirty hands and instruments. The medical board wouldn't listen. Called my theories controversial. Said I was deranged with grief. The bitterness in his voice revealed the depth of the wound, not just the loss of his family, but the dismissal of his professional judgment, the rejection by his peers. You came here to practice your methods, Grace realized. With Margaret. Jackson nodded. She was willing to listen, to try. We haven't lost a mother to fever in this county in 4 years. Grace's hand rested on her belly where the child within shifted and turned. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me. Jackson met her gaze, something vulnerable and fierce in his eyes. I won't let it happen to you. He said the words of promise and a defiance all at once. Not if I can help it. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not romance, not even friendship exactly, but a deeper understanding. They were both running from ghosts, both seeking redemption in their own ways. And perhaps in this unlikely place they might find a measure of peace together. The package Margaret had brought remained on the table, still wrapped. Jackson pushed it toward Grace. For you, he said, Margaret's idea. Surprised, Grace untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a length of soft blue fabric perfect for making baby clothes. Beneath it lay a small cake of lavender soap and a jar of what appeared to be salve for stretched skin. She thought you might need these, Jackson explained, a hint of awkwardness in his posture. Said a woman in your condition should have comforts. Grace ran her fingers over the fabric, throat tight with unexpected emotion. It had been so long since anyone had shown her such thoughtfulness. Please thank her for me, she managed. It's very kind. Jackson nodded, then turned away to stoke the fire, allowing her a moment to compose herself. As the evening settled around them, Grace felt something unfamiliar take root in her heart. Not quite hope, but perhaps its precursors, the possibility that here in this remote cabin with this wounded man, she might find not just safety, but something like belonging. October melted into November, the days growing shorter, the nights colder. Snow fell more frequently, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wilderness. Grace's body changed too, her belly growing rounder, her movements more careful. The baby was active now, kicking and turning at all hours, making its presence impossible to ignore. Jackson watched these changes with a physician's eye, noting her diet, ensuring she rested, preparing herbal teas for the backaches and swollen ankles that troubled her. His care was professional, respectful, never crossing boundaries, always maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Yet other changes, more subtle, had begun to emerge. Jackson spoke more, sharing stories from his time as a military surgeon, explaining medical concepts as he worked. Grace found herself laughing occasionally at his dry observations, sharing memories of her mother's seamstress shop, the fine ladies who had come for fittings and gossip. Margaret visited twice more, checking Grace's progress, bringing supplies and news from town. After her second visit, she pulled Jackson aside, their conversation too low for Grace to hear. Later, Grace found him at his desk reviewing his medical texts with renewed intensity, making notes in the margins. "Everything all right?" she asked, setting a cup of tea beside him. Jackson looked up, his expression grave. "Baby's big," he said. "Margaret's concerned about the delivery." Fear fluttered in Grace's chest. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong," he clarified. "Just need to be prepared. First babies can be difficult." He hesitated, then added, "Sarah was in labor for 20 hours with Emma." It was the most personal detail he'd shared about his late wife, offered as both warning and reassurance. Grace nodded, understanding the weight of the comparison. "I'm stronger than I look," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "I know." That night, Grace dreamed of Charles. He stood in the cabin doorway, snow swirling behind him, his face twisted with the cold rage she knew too well. "Did you think you could hide from me?" he asked, stepping inside, closing the door behind him. "Did you think I wouldn't find you?" She tried to run, but her swollen belly made her clumsy, slow. Charles caught her arm, fingers digging into flesh with familiar cruelty. "You and the child belong to me," he hissed. "I'll never let you go." Grace woke with a strangled cry, heart pounding, sweat cold on her skin, despite the warmth of the cabin. It took her several moments to orient herself, to remember where she was, that she was safe. A shadow moved beside the bed. Jackson, concern etched in the lines of his face, a lantern held low to avoid blinding her. "Nightmare?" he asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak past the knot of fear in her throat. Jackson set the lantern on the bedside table and retreated to his chair by the fire, giving her space. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer empty comfort. He simply remained present, a silent sentinel against the darkness. As her breathing steadied, Grace found her voice. "It was Charles," she said, the name bitter on her tongue. "My husband." Jackson remained still, listening. "He's a politician in Philadelphia." She continued, the words spilling out now that the dam had broken. "Respected, admired. A monster behind closed doors." Her hand moved to her belly, protective. "If he finds out about the baby, he'll never stop looking for us. He'll take the child and discard me." "Why?" Jackson asked, the single word weighted with genuine inquiry. "He needs an heir," Grace explained. "For his legacy, his political future. He's always been ambitious." She swallowed hard. "And cruel. He enjoyed hurting me." The fire crackled in the silence that followed her confession. Jackson's expression had hardened, though his voice remained calm when he finally spoke. "He won't find you here," he said with quiet certainty. "Not before the baby comes. After that—" He hesitated. "After that, we'll figure something out." "We," the word hung between them, unexpected and profound. Not a promise of forever, but an acknowledgement that they were in this together, at least for now. Grace nodded, gratitude warming her chest. "Thank you." Jackson rose, moving toward the kitchen area. "Tea," he offered. "Might help you sleep." "Please," she replied, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not just kindness, but respect for her strength in surviving and protecting herself and her child. As he prepared the tea, Grace watched him, the strange, solitary man who had opened his home and perhaps his heart to a pregnant stranger. In another life, they might never have crossed paths. In this one, their shared wounds had created an unlikely bond. The baby kicked a strong movement that made Grace gasp softly. Without thinking, she reached out as Jackson approached with the tea. "Here," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her belly. "Feel." Jackson froze his expression, a complex mix of surprise, hesitation, and something deeper, more vulnerable. For a moment, she thought he might pull away. Then the baby kicked again, and his eyes widened slightly. "Strong," he murmured, a hint of approval in his voice. "Like its mother," Grace replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. Jackson's gaze met hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw the ghost of a real smile cross his face. "Yes," he agreed, "exactly like its mother." He withdrew his hand, passing her the tea, but something had shifted between them. A boundary crossed, a connection deepened. As Grace sipped the soothing herbal brew, she felt the lingering warmth of his touch, not just on her skin, but somewhere deeper, in a place she'd thought long frozen by fear and betrayal. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the first heavy snow of winter. Inside, two broken people sat in companionable silence, watching the fire burn low, each contemplating the strange turns of fate that had brought them to this moment of unexpected peace. The first week of December brought the heaviest snowfall yet, blanketing the cabin and surrounding forest in 3 feet of pristine white. The world beyond the windows seemed to hold its breath, muffled and still. Inside, Grace moved with increasing difficulty, her body unwieldy, the baby pressing down, now preparing for birth. Jackson watched her with growing concern, noting her winces of discomfort, the way she pressed a hand to her lower back when she thought he wasn't looking. According to his calculations and Margaret's assessment, the baby should arrive within the week. But Margaret hadn't visited in 10 days, prevented by the treacherous roads and mounting snow. "You should rest more," he told Grace, as she stubbornly continued to help with meals and light chores. "I'll rest when I need to," she replied, her tone brooking no argument. "Idle hands make for a restless mind." Jackson recognized the steel beneath her words, the same determination that had brought her across the country, away from a monster, in search of safety for her child. He didn't press the issue, but he made sure the path to the outhouse was kept clear, that the cabin remained warm, that she ate well, and drank the teas he prepared to strengthen her for what was to come. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Grace working on baby clothes fashioned from the blue fabric Margaret had brought Jackson, carving a small wooden cradle from pine he'd harvested and dried months earlier. Neither commented on the domesticity of the scene, on how their initial wariness had transformed into something like partnership. "What will you name it?" Jackson asked one night, his knife moving smoothly over the wood, shaping a decorative edge on the cradle. Grace's hands stilled on the tiny gown she was hemming. "I haven't decided," she admitted. "If it's a boy, perhaps after my father, James." She hesitated. "If it's a girl, I thought maybe Hope." Jackson looked up, something flickering in his eyes. "Good name," he said after a moment. "Means something." "It does." She agreed, not elaborating on the hours she'd spent contemplating her future, her child's future, the hope she dared not name aloud, that they might find a permanent place of safety, perhaps even happiness. They fell back into comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, the scrape of Jackson's knife against wood, the soft sigh of fabric as Grace pulled thread through it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, a reminder of the harsh world beyond their sanctuary. Later that night, as Grace settled into bed, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. She gasped, one hand clutching the blanket, the other pressed to her belly. The pain subsided after a moment, but it left her breathless, aware that the time was drawing near. Jackson, still at his desk reviewing medical texts, looked up sharply. "Contraction?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak until the echo of pain had fully receded. "I think so," she managed finally, "but it's past now." He rose, moving to the bedside with the professional demeanor she'd come to recognize, his doctor's mask, as she thought of it. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her abdomen. At her nod, he placed his hands on her belly, feeling the tightness of the muscles, the position of the baby. His touch was impersonal, clinical, yet there was a gentleness to it that belied his gruff exterior. "Could be practice contractions," he said after a moment. "Body preparing. or could be the start of labor. Early yet to tell, he stepped back, his expression thoughtful. Try to sleep. Wake me if they become regular or more painful. Grace nodded, settling back against the pillows. She doubted she'd sleep much, too aware now of her body's signals, the weight and pressure of the child within. Jackson returned to his desk, but she noticed he didn't resume reading. Instead, he began organizing instruments, laying out clean cloths, preparing as if for battle. The night passed slowly. Grace dozed fitfully, waking to occasional twinges that never developed into the regular pattern of true labor. By morning, the pains had subsided, leaving her tired but relieved for the reprieve. Jackson, who had eventually moved to his chair by the fire but hadn't appeared to sleep, observed her with a physician's careful eye as she rose and prepared breakfast. False alarm, she said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He nodded, though his expression remained watchful. Common near the end. Body rehearsing. The day passed quietly, Grace moving more slowly than usual, but determined to maintain their routine. Jackson chopped extra wood, filled every available container with water, and checked his medical supplies 3 times. Preparations without acknowledgement of what they were preparing for. As evening fell, bringing with it another snowstorm, Grace felt a different kind of tension in the air. Jackson stood at the window, staring out at the swirling white, his posture rigid. What is it? She asked, looking up from the mending in her lap. Riders, he replied, his voice tight. Coming up the trail. Grace's heart stuttered. Charles, she whispered, fear a cold knife in her gut. Jackson shook his head. Can't tell. 3 of them. He moved to the door, reaching for his rifle. Stay inside. Before he could step out, hoofbeats sounded in the yard, followed by a voice calling through the storm. Jackson! It's Edward Fleming. I've come for Grace Sullivan. The blood drained from Grace's face. Edward. The man who had abandoned her at the station, who knew her real name, who could lead Charles right to her doorstep. Jackson's expression hardened. Stay here, he repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. He stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Grace moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Through the falling snow, she could make out 3 mounted figures. Edward sat atop a bay gelding, his city clothes inadequate for the Montana winter. Beside him, 2 rough-looking men on sturdy mountain ponies, hired muscle by the look of them. Jackson stood on the porch, rifle held low, but ready, his stance relaxed but alert. She couldn't hear the conversation over the wind, but she could see Edward gesturing emphatically, then pointing toward the cabin. Fear curdled in her stomach. Why had Edward returned? What did he want with her now after abandoning her months ago? The answer came in a sudden, terrible flash of understanding. Charles. Edward was working for Charles, had been all along. His initial seduction, the journey west, even the abandonment, all calculated to separate her from her Philadelphia connections, to isolate her until Charles could claim her and the child. Another pain seized her, sharper than before, stealing her breath. Grace clutched the window frame, willing it to pass quickly. This wasn't fear. This was her body beginning the process that would bring her child into the world. Outside, the confrontation continued. Edward dismounted, taking a step toward Jackson, who didn't move. One of the hired men reached toward his belt, where Grace could see the outline of a pistol. No, she whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. But Jackson remained steady, his posture suggesting he was speaking calmly despite the tension. After a moment, Edward stopped advancing, gesturing more aggressively now. Jackson's head shook once definitive. Grace couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. Gathering her courage, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting through her woolen dress. Grace, Edward called, a false smile spreading across his face. Thank God we've found you. Your husband's been frantic with worry. Jackson's head turned slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on the 3 men. Go inside, he said, his voice low but firm. Grace ignored him, drawing herself up to her full height, despite the weight of her belly and the pain beginning to build again. What are you doing here, Edward? She asked, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. Edward's smile faltered. I've come to take you home, of course. Charles has been searching for months. He's in town now with the proper authorities. He gestured to the men beside him. These gentlemen are deputies from the territorial office. It was a lie, Grace could tell by the shifty expressions on the men's weathered faces. Not lawmen, but hired guns, probably from the saloon in town. I am home, she replied steadily, and I'm not going anywhere with you. Edward's expression hardened. Don't be foolish, Grace. Charles is your husband. He has legal rights to you and the child. This arrangement, he gestured dismissively at Jackson in the cabin, is inappropriate and temporary at best. Another contraction gripped her stronger than the last. Grace pressed a hand to the porch railing, fighting to keep her expression neutral until it passed. Jackson noticed. His posture shifted subtly, placing himself more directly between her and the men. She's not going, he stated, his voice like iron, especially not now. Edward's eyes narrowed as he took in Grace's condition more fully. The child is coming, he realized aloud. All the more reason she should be with her husband, not some mountain hermit. My husband, Grace said, her voice cold with fury, is a monster who beat me for years. I will not return to him. I will not allow my child anywhere near him. She stepped forward, one hand protectively over her belly. If you were truly concerned for my welfare, Edward, you wouldn't have abandoned me at that station. Edward had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he recovered quickly. Charles is a respected politician. These allegations are true, Jackson interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying. And you're not taking her anywhere. One of the hired men spat into the snow. Look, we ain't here to argue. The lady's coming with us one way or another. Her husband's paying good money. Jackson's rifle came up slightly, not pointed directly at the men, but no longer casually held. She's not property to be claimed, he said, each word deliberate. She's a free woman making her own choice. Edward's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. She's my Charles's wife. He has rights. Not here, Jackson replied. Not to her, not to the child. The standoff stretched, tension crackling like the electricity before a storm. Then Grace gasped, doubling over as the strongest contraction yet tore through her. Grace, Jackson's voice held concern, though he didn't take his eyes off the three men. It's starting, she managed through gritted teeth. The baby's coming. Edward looked alarmed. All the more reason to get her to town, to proper medical care. Jackson's laugh was short, humorless. In this storm, on horseback, while she's in labor. He shook his head. You'd kill her and the child. The hired men exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't what they'd signed on for. Look, the older of the two said, we was told to bring a woman back to town. Didn't sign up for no birthing business. Edward rounded on him. You'll do as you're paid to do. Not for all the gold in Montana, the man retorted. My ma died in childbirth. Ain't risking that on my conscience. He turned his horse. Come on, Hank. We're heading back. What about our money? The second man, Hank asked. Half now, half when we bring her in. That was the deal. Edward's face contorted with rage. You can't just leave. Porter will have your hides. The older man spat again. He's welcome to try. He nodded to Jackson. Take care of her, Doc. With that, the two men turned their horses and rode back down the trail, disappearing into the swirling snow. Edward remained, his expression a mixture of fury and calculation. This isn't over, he said finally. Charles will come himself, and he won't be alone. Jackson's rifle didn't waver. Then he'll find me waiting, he replied simply. Now get off my property. For a moment it seemed Edward might argue further. Then another contraction seized Grace, causing her to cry out despite her best efforts. The sound seemed to decide him. You've made a grave mistake, he said, remounting his horse. Both of you. With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped after his departing hired men, his figure quickly swallowed by the storm. Jackson waited until he was out of sight before lowering his rifle and turning to Grace, concern etching deep lines around his eyes. Inside, he said gently, supporting her with a strong arm around her waist. Let's get you warm. Grace leaned against him gratefully as they made their way back into the cabin. The pain receded momentarily, allowing her to catch her breath. He'll be back, she said, fear and certainty mingling in her voice. With Charles. Jackson nodded, helping her to the bed. Probably, he agreed, no false reassurance in his tone. But not tonight, not in this storm. He checked the fire, adding another log. And by morning, things will be different. Grace understood his meaning. By morning, the baby would be here. The situation irrevocably changed. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the child shift and turn, preparing for its journey into the world. I'm afraid, she admitted, the words barely audible. Jackson paused in his preparations, meeting her gaze directly. I know, he said simply, but you're not alone. He hesitated, then added, I promised you'd be safe here. I meant it. In his eyes, Grace saw not just determination, but something deeper, a promise made not from duty or obligation, but from something that had grown between them over these months of shared solitude and quiet understanding. I believe you, she replied softly. Outside, the storm intensified, snow piling against the windows, wind moaning through the pines. Inside, Grace breathed through the next contraction, drawing strength from the knowledge that whatever came next, birth, confrontation, flight, she would face it with this quiet, steadfast man beside her. The night stretched ahead full of pain and promise, danger and hope. Grace closed her eyes, gathering her courage for the battle to come. Her child would be born free, she vowed silently. Free from Charles's cruelty, free from the chains that had bound her for so long. And perhaps in this cabin with this man who had lost everything once before, they might find not just safety, but a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The night unfolded in measured breaths and muffled cries. Grace's labor progressed slowly, each contraction building upon the last, like waves against a shore, gradually wearing away her resistance. Jackson moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, heating water, preparing clean linens, arranging his instruments with the precision of a man who understood that order might be the only barrier between life and death. Outside, the storm raged, snow piling in drifts against the cabin walls, wind finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. Inside, a different kind of storm brewed, one of pain and anticipation, fear and determination. Try to rest between, Jackson advised, his voice steady as he checked Grace's pulse. Save your strength. Grace nodded, too focused on breathing to speak. Sweat dampened her hair, plastering it to her forehead, despite the winter chill that seeped through the cabin's walls. When the next contraction eased, she let her head fall back against the pillows. Jackson had arranged, her eyes seeking his. They'll come back, she said, the words barely above a whisper. Charles won't give up. Jackson's expression remained impassive, but something hardened in his eyes. Let them come, he replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than boastful. We'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, this is what matters. He nodded toward her belly where their shared focus lay. Another contraction seized her, stronger than the last. Grace clutched the sheets, a low moan escaping, despite her efforts to remain silent. Jackson's hand found hers, strong and calloused, offering something to grip against the pain. She took it without hesitation, past the point of pride or reservation. Good, he murmured, as the contraction peaked, then gradually subsided. You're doing well. The night deepened around them, the cabin's interior, a world of its own, lit by lantern light that cast long shadows across rough-hewn walls. Jackson checked his pocket watch periodically, making notes in a small leather journal, tracking the progression with clinical detachment. But when he thought Grace wasn't looking, concern creased his brow, his eyes lingering on her face with an expression that went beyond professional interest. After several hours, he helped her walk slowly around the cabin, supporting her weight. When contractions came, explaining in his quiet way that movement might help speed things along. Grace leaned on his strength, gratefully, past caring about propriety or boundaries. In this moment, they were united in a common purpose, bringing her child safely into the world. During a brief respite between pains, Grace found herself studying Jackson's face, the lines etched around his eyes, the flecks of gray in his beard, the careful concentration in his gaze. A face that had seen war and loss, that had closed itself off from the world, yet somehow had opened enough to let her in. You've done this before. She said, not a question, but an observation. Jackson nodded, helping her back to the bed as another contraction approached. Army surgeon, he replied. Field hospitals during the war. Then Boston. A shadow crossed his face. And with Sarah. The mention of his wife hung in the air between them, a ghost given form through speech. Grace understood, what remained unsaid, that this moment carried echoes of his greatest loss, his deepest failure. You won't fail this time, she said with quiet certainty, meeting his gaze directly. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her perception or gratitude for her faith. He didn't respond verbally, but his hand tightened briefly around hers, an acknowledgement that needed no words. As midnight came and went, Grace's labor intensified. The contractions grew closer together, each one more powerful than the last, leaving her gasping and trembling in their wake. Jackson's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more focused, his movements more deliberate. He washed his hands thoroughly with lye soap, an action Grace had seen him perform countless times over the months, but now understood the vital importance of. Almost time, he said, arranging clean towels and instruments beside the bed. The babies moved down. Grace nodded, gathering her strength for what was to come. Fear and anticipation mingled in her chest, making her heart race. This was the moment she had both dreaded and longed for, the culmination of months of uncertainty, the beginning of a new chapter she could scarcely imagine. "I need to check your progress," Jackson said, his tone professional but gentle. "May I?" At her nod, he examined her with clinical efficiency, his touch impersonal yet respectful. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Grace caught the slight furrow of his brow, the momentary tightening of his jaw. "What is it?" she asked between ragged breaths. Jackson hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "Baby's turned slightly," he explained. "Not ideal, but not dangerous yet. When the next contraction comes, I need you to change a position. It might help." Grace followed his instructions, turning onto her side, then to her hands and knees as he directed, fighting through pain that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. Jackson's voice remained steady, guiding her through each adjustment, each new wave of agony. Outside, the wind howled a counterpoint to Grace's muffled cries. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting the cabin in a warm, flickering glow. Time lost meaning, measured only in the space between contractions and Jackson's quiet words of encouragement, in the gradual progress of new life forcing its way into the world. "I can't," Grace gasped after a particularly brutal contraction, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this." "You can," Jackson replied, his voice firm but kind. "You're stronger than you know." He wiped her brow with a cool cloth, his eyes holding hers. "Almost there now, I can see the head." Something in his tone gave her strength, not false encouragement, but honest assessment from a man who had seen the worst and still believed in possibility. Grace drew a deep breath, gathering her remaining courage for the final push. "Now," Jackson instructed, as the next contraction will. "Wishnu." Grace bore down with all her might, a primal sound torn from her throat pain, transcending into something beyond agony, beyond endurance. And then suddenly released a sensation of emptying, of transformation. A moment of silence, breathless and eternal. Then piercing the quiet, a cry thin and indignant, the first protest of a new life against the cold reality of existence. Jackson moved quickly, his hands sure as they received the tiny slippery form. "A girl," he said, his voice rough with an emotion Grace had never heard from him before. "You have a daughter." He placed the squalling infant on Grace's chest, still attached by the cord that had nourished her these long months. Grace stared down at the red, wrinkled face, the tiny fists waving in outrage, and felt her heart expand in her chest until she thought it might burst. "Hello," she whispered, running a trembling finger along a perfect miniature cheek. "Hello, Hope." Jackson worked efficiently to deliver the afterbirth, to tie and cut the cord to ensure both mother and child were stable. But his eyes kept returning to the baby. Something like wonder in his expression, quickly masked whenever Grace glanced his way. "She's strong," he said as he helped Grace clean and swaddle the infant. "Good lungs, good color." Simple statements of fact, yet Grace heard the relief behind them, the professional assessment tinged with personal investment. This birth, unlike the one that had haunted him for 5 years, had ended well. Not a redemption perhaps, but a step toward healing. The storm outside had begun to abate, the wind's howl diminishing to a mournful sigh. Dawn wasn't far off, pale light beginning to seep around the edges of the curtains. Grace cradled her daughter close, marveling at the perfect miniature features, the surprising strength in the tiny fingers that wrapped around her own. Jackson finished his work, washing his hands thoroughly, before stoking the fire back to full strength. He moved with the careful quietness of someone trying not to disturb a moment of reverence. "You should rest," he said, setting a cup of water within Grace's reach. "Both of you." Grace looked up, meeting his gaze. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for what she felt, but all she had to offer. Jackson nodded once, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "Did what needed doing," he replied, his typical understatement. But as he turned away, Grace caught something in his expression, a softness, a vulnerability quickly hidden. And she understood that this night had changed something fundamental between them, had forged a connection that went beyond their careful partnership of the past months. Her eyelids grew heavy, exhaustion, claiming her now that the ordeal was over. She settled deeper into the pillows, hope nestled securely against her chest, their heartbeats finding a shared rhythm. Sleep came swiftly, dreamless and deep. When Grace woke, the cabin was filled with the diffuse light of mid-morning. She blinked disoriented momentarily, then felt the warm weight against her chest and remembered. Hope, her daughter, born in the night safe and whole. She glanced around the cabin, finding Jackson seated at his desk, writing in what appeared to be his medical journal. He looked up at her movement, setting down his pen and approaching the bed with quiet steps. How are you feeling? He asked, his clinical gaze assessing her for signs of fever or other complications. Sore, Grace admitted, but well enough. She glanced down at Hope, still sleeping peacefully. She's beautiful, isn't she? Jackson's expression softened as he looked at the infant. Yes, he agreed simply. He helped Grace sit up, arranged pillows behind her back, brought fresh water and a simple breakfast of porridge sweetened with honey. Small kindnesses offered without fuss or expectation. When Hope began to stir, fussing with hunger, he turned away to give Grace privacy as she navigated the unfamiliar territory of nursing. The storm's passed, he commented, looking out the window where sunlight sparkled on fresh snow. Roads will be passable by tomorrow, most likely. The statement hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Passable roads meant Margaret might visit, bringing welcome supplies and experienced help. But they also meant Charles and Edward could return, bringing with them threats to the fragile peace they'd established. What will we do? Grace asked quietly, her arms tightening instinctively around Hope. Jackson turned back to face her, his expression somber but determined. Whatever's necessary, he replied. It wasn't a detailed plan, but the quiet certainty in his voice offered more comfort than elaborate strategies might have. The day passed in a haze of new routines, both Grace and Jackson adjusting to the presence that had transformed their quiet existence. Hope nursed, slept, cried, each action a discovery, each need a puzzle to be solved. Jackson observed with the attention of a physician, offering suggestions when asked, but otherwise allowing Grace to find her own way as a mother. As evening approached, bringing with it the early darkness of winter, Jackson sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. The sight sent a chill through Grace, a reminder of the threat that lingered beyond their door. Do you think they'll really come? She asked, her voice low, to avoid waking Hope, who slept in a small wooden cradle Jackson had placed near the bed. Jackson's hands didn't pause in their work. Yes, he said simply. A man like your husband doesn't give up easily. He glanced up, meeting her gaze. But neither do I. The quiet conviction in his voice steadied her, as did the knowledge that this taciturn man who chose his words with such care had placed himself firmly on her side. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Night fell, bringing with it a stillness that seemed almost unnatural after the previous day's storm. Grace slept fitfully, waking to tend to Hope's needs, each time scanning the cabin in the dim light, reassured by the sight of Jackson in his chair, by the fire rifle across his knees, keeping watch. Morning arrived without incident, sunlight streaming through the windows, reflecting blindingly off the pristine snow outside. Jackson prepared breakfast, then bundled up to check on the animals and bring in more firewood. Grace sat in the chair by the fire, Hope cradled in her arms, allowing herself a moment of peace, of simple gratitude for this small, perfect life she held. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the quiet. Grace's heart leapt to her throat, fear sending a surge of adrenaline through her weary body. She rose, moving quickly to the window, peering through the curtain. Relief washed over her at the sight of Margaret Fletcher dismounting from her sturdy pony. The older woman trudged through the snow toward the cabin, carrying her familiar basket of supplies. Behind her, a second rider remained, mounted, a Native American man Grace didn't recognize, wrapped in a colorful blanket against the cold. Jackson emerged from the woodshed, greeting Margaret with a nod, before turning to exchange words with the second visitor. Their conversation was brief, the man gesturing toward the trail that led back to town, Jackson listening intently before nodding his thanks. When they entered the cabin, Margaret had immediately crossed to Grace, her weathered face breaking into a rare smile at the sight of Hope. Well done, she said, examining the infant with experienced eyes. Strong girl you've got there. Grace smiled, pride warming her chest. She is that. Margaret turned to Jackson, who was hanging his coat by the door. And did you remember everything I taught you? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Everything, he confirmed. Mother and child both well. Margaret nodded, satisfied. Good. She set her basket on the table, unpacking herbs, clean bandages, and a jar of what looked like salve. Now let me check you both properly. While Margaret examined Grace and the baby, Jackson spoke quietly with the Native American man who had introduced himself as Thomas Running Elk, a Blackfoot scout who sometimes carried messages between settlements during the winter months. Their conversation was too low for Grace to hear clearly, but she caught fragments in town, asking questions. Tomorrow, maybe. Her stomach tightened with apprehension. Charles, it had to be. When Thomas departed and Margaret had finished her examination, pronouncing both mother and child healthy, Jackson shared what he had learned. Charles Porter arrived in White Ridge 2 days ago, he said, his voice deliberately even, with papers claiming his wife has been abducted, demanding assistance from local authorities. Grace's arms tightened around Hope. They won't help him, will they? Margaret snorted derisively. Sheriff Miller's no fool. He knows the difference between a concerned husband and a man with darker motives. She fixed Grace with a penetrating look. But the law is complicated when it comes to wives and children. Your husband has certain rights. Not to hurt her. Jackson said, the words clipped definitive. Not to force her. Margaret nodded in agreement. No decent man would argue otherwise. But Porter has money influence, and there are always those willing to look the other way for the right price. What can we do? Grace asked, fear threatening to overwhelm her hard-won calm. Margaret and Jackson exchanged a look, some unspoken communication passing between them. There are options, Margaret said carefully. Ways to disappear if needed. I have connections, people who help women in situations like yours. An underground railroad of sorts, Jackson elaborated. For wives escaping dangerous husbands. Hope stirred in Grace's arms, whimpering softly. Grace soothed her automatically, her mind racing with the implications of what they were suggesting. Disappearing, starting yet again in some new place with a new identity. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. But that's not the only option. Margaret continued, watching Grace's face closely. Sometimes the best defense is standing your ground, especially when you have allies. Jackson moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. Porter doesn't know these mountains, he said quietly. Doesn't understand the people here. That gives us an advantage. What are you suggesting? Grace asked, looking between them. A reckoning, Margaret replied, her weathered face solemn. Some men only understand strength. Perhaps it's time your husband faced someone he can't intimidate or buy off. The idea settled in Grace's mind, not running, not hiding, but confronting the monster who had haunted her steps. It was both terrifying and strangely appealing, the thought of finally standing before Charles without fear, with Jackson and Margaret beside her. Vaughn. I don't want violence, she said softly, looking down at Hope's innocent face. Not for her sake. Sometimes words are enough, Jackson replied, turning back from the window. When backed by resolve and truth. Margaret nodded in agreement. Truth has power, especially against men who build their lives on lies. She began repacking her basket, movements brisk and efficient. I should return to town, keep an eye on things. Thomas will bring word if Porter makes a move. Before she left, Margaret pulled Grace aside, her voice dropping to ensure Jackson couldn't hear. That man, she said, nodding toward Jackson, has carried his grief like a stone these 5 years. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you and that child when you're not watching. She squeezed Grace's hand. Whatever you decide, remember that. You're not alone anymore. With that cryptic observation, she departed, leaving Grace to ponder her words as she settled back in the chair by the fire, Hope nursing contentedly in her arms. Jackson busied himself with chores, seemingly determined to maintain their routine despite the sword hanging over their heads. But Grace noticed the way he checked the rifle more frequently, how he split extra wood for the fire, how his gaze continually returned to the window, scanning the horizon for approaching riders. As evening approached, Grace found herself drawn to the small leather pouch she'd carried since Philadelphia. From it, she extracted the unfinished embroidery her mother had begun, wildflowers surrounding the incomplete phrase, "Freedom comes." With Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Grace sat by the lantern, light needle in hand, contemplating the blank space where the rest of her mother's message should have been. What had Esther Sullivan intended to stitch there? What wisdom had she meant to leave behind? Jackson, noticing her contemplation, approached quietly. Your mother's, he asked, nodding toward the embroidery. Grace nodded. She started it before she died. Never told me what the rest was supposed to say. She ran her fingers over the delicate stitches, feeling a connection across time and space to the woman who had taught her strength. I've been carrying it, thinking someday I'd know how to finish it. Jackson studied the piece, his expression thoughtful. What do you think it should say? Grace considered the question, rolling possible endings through her mind. Freedom comes with courage, perhaps, or sacrifice. She sighed softly. Or maybe just freedom comes when you stop running. Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, recognition, understanding. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Grace agreed, a sad smile touching her lips. She survived slavery, built a life from nothing, raised me alone after my father died. Her hands stilled on the fabric. She taught me to endure. But I think she would have wanted more for me than just endurance. Jackson nodded slowly. There's a difference, he said, his voice low and contemplative, between surviving and living. A shadow crossed his face, and Grace knew he was thinking of his own existence these past 5 years, surviving, but not truly living. The moments stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Then hope stirred, breaking the spell. Grace set aside the embroidery to tend to her daughter, and Jackson returned to his vigil by the window, each lost in their own thoughts about survival, freedom, and the cost of both. Night fell, bringing with it a tense quiet. Jackson insisted Grace take the bed, arguing that she needed proper rest to recover her strength. He would keep watch, he said, unwilling to be caught unawares if Charles made a move under cover of darkness. Grace woke several times to nurse hope, each time finding Jackson in his chair, by the fire rifle across his knees, gaze fixed on the door or window. Once their eyes met across the darkened cabin and something passed between them, a wordless acknowledgement of the stakes of the pun that had formed in these months of shared solitude. Morning arrived, clear and cold sunlight gleaming on the pristine snow. Jackson, who appeared not to have slept at all, prepared breakfast as usual, his movements betraying only the slightest hint of fatigue. They ate in companionable silence, interrupted only by Hope's occasional coos and fusses. As Grace cleared the dishes, a sound outside caught her attention, the distinctive crunch of hooves on packed snow. Jackson was instantly alert, moving to the window with practiced stealth. 3 riders, he reported, his voice calm but tight, coming up the trail. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, fear and determination warring in her chest. Charles, Jackson nodded grimly. Based on Thomas's description, with Edward and another man, looks like one of the deputies from town. He moved to the rifle prop by the door, checking it with practiced hands before turning to Grace. Stay inside with Hope, he instructed, no matter what you hear. Grace wanted to argue, to insist on facing Charles herself, but Hope's weight in her arms reminded her of responsibilities that transcended personal courage. She nodded reluctantly. Be careful. She said the words inadequate for what she felt. Jackson's expression softened momentarily. Always am, he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips before he stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Grace moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains, Hope held securely against her chest. The 3 riders approached slowly, the leader easily identifiable as Charles Porter, even at a distance. He sat tall and straight in the saddle, every inch the distinguished politician in his fine coat and hat. Beside him rode Edward, looking considerably less comfortable on horseback, and a burly man wearing what appeared to be a deputy's badge, though Grace suspected it might be as fraudulent as Edward's claims. Jackson stood on the porch, rifle held low but ready, his stance relaxed but alert. He had positioned himself perfectly, not threatening, but unmistakably prepared to defend his home. The riders halted a respectful distance from the cabin. Charles dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to Edward, who remained on horseback alongside the supposed deputy. Even from her limited vantage point, Grace could see the cold calculation in Charles's expression as he surveyed the cabin, the surrounding wilderness, and Jackson himself. I'm looking for my wife, Grace Porter, Charles called, his voice carrying clearly through the still morning air. I have reason to believe she's being held here against her will. Jackson didn't move. No one here by that name, he replied evenly, and no one being held against their will. Charles took a step forward, his charming political smile firmly in place. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Charles Porter, Philadelphia State Representative. My wife disappeared several months ago in a delicate condition. I've been searching for her ever since. Heard you were in town. Jackson said, not acknowledging the introduction. Asking questions, making accusations. Charles's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Merely trying to locate my missing wife, as is my right. Our rights, Jackson repeated the word hanging in the air between them. Interesting concept. Charles's facade of geniality slipped slightly, a flash of the cold anger Grace knew so well appearing in his eyes. I don't believe we've been properly introduced, Mr. Reed, Jackson supplied. Jackson Reed. Something flickered across Charles's face, recognition perhaps, or calculation. The doctor, he said, his tone shifting subtly. I've heard about you. Boston wasn't it before the incident. Grace's breath caught. How could Charles know about Jackson's past? Then understanding dawned. Edward must have made inquiries in town after their confrontation days earlier, gathering ammunition for this moment. If the reference to his disgrace affected Jackson, he gave no sign. Not relevant to the present situation, he said calmly. Charles's smile returned sharper now. On the contrary, I think it's very relevant. A discredited physician living in isolation, harboring a married woman against her will. The territorial authorities might take a dim view of such arrangements. The same authorities you've been attempting to bribe in town. Jackson countered, his voice still measured. Sheriff Miller seems unimpressed with your methods. A muscle twitched in Charles's jaw, the only indication that the barb had struck home. I've done nothing improper. I'm simply a husband concerned for his wife's welfare, particularly in her condition. Concerned husbands, Jackson observed, don't typically leave bruises on their wives' bodies. The statement hung in the cold air, direct and damning. Edward shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The deputy looked between Charles and Jackson, uncertainty clear in his expression. Charles's mask slipped, further his eyes hardening to chips of ice. Be very careful with your accusations, Dr. Reed. Slander is a serious matter. Not slander if it's true, Jackson replied simply. I've seen the evidence as a physician. Grace watched the exchange with her heart in her throat, amazed at Jackson's calm in the face of Charles's barely controlled rage. She had never seen anyone stand up to her husband this way, had never imagined someone defending her so steadfastly. Charles took another step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. Whatever my wife has told you, I assure you she's prone to exaggeration, hysteria even. Her condition makes her unreliable. Her condition, Jackson said the words deliberate, is that of a new mother. Your daughter was born 2 days ago. Both are healthy and safe. He shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on the rifle. And they'll remain that way. The news seemed to catch Charles off guard. For a moment, naked calculation crossed his face, the political value of a child, the heir he had wanted, weighed against the complications of a wife who had fled his control. All the more reason she should be with her husband. He recovered smoothly. A child needs its father. Surely you of all people understand the importance of family, Dr. Reed, given your loss. It was a cruel thrust deliberately aimed at Jackson's deepest wound. Grace bit her lip to keep from crying out in protest, her arms tightening around Hope. Jackson remained still, only the slightest tightening of his jaw betraying the impact of Charles's words. Family, he said after a moment, his voice steady, isn't about possession. It's about protection, safety. His gaze pinned Charles, things you failed to provide. Charles's facade cracked, genuine anger bleeding through. You have no right to judge me, no right to interfere in my marriage. My wife belongs to me by law and by God's ordinance. She belongs to herself, Jackson countered, as does the child. I'll have them back, Charles snapped, mask fully slipping now. One way or another, and when I do, she'll regret this little adventure. His hand moved to his coat where Grace knew he typically carried a small pistol. Now step aside, I'm taking my wife and child home. Jackson didn't flinch, didn't raise his rifle, but something in his posture changed, a subtle shift from defensive to prepared. No, he said simply, you are not. The standoff stretched, tension crackling between the two men. Edward looked increasingly uncomfortable while the deputy's hand hovered near his own weapon, clearly uncertain whose side he should be taking. Then from down the trail came the sound of approaching horses. All heads turned to see Margaret Fletcher riding toward the cabin, accompanied by a stern-looking man in a sheriff's badge and 2 armed deputies. Porter, the sheriff called as they approached. Thought I made myself clear in town. No vigilante actions in my jurisdiction. Charles's expression shifted rapidly, political mask sliding back into place. "Sheriff Miller," he greeted smoothly. "No vigilante action here. Just a civil conversation with the man holding my wife." Sheriff Miller dismounted, his weathered face unimpressed as he surveyed the scene. "Doesn't look civil from where I'm standing." He nodded to Jackson. "Reed." "Sheriff," Jackson acknowledged. "Margaret." Margaret's sharp eyes took in the situation at a glance. "Thought you might need some official presence," she said by way of explanation. "Considering the circumstances." The sheriff turned to Charles, his expression hardening. "Got some interesting telegrams this morning," he said conversationally. "From Philadelphia. Seems there are some outstanding questions about your conduct there. Allegations from several women in your household staff." Charles's composure slipped momentarily before he recovered. "Baseless accusations," he said dismissively. "Disgruntled former employees, nothing more." "Maybe," Miller conceded, "but enough to make me cautious about handing over a woman and child to your care." He glanced at the man wearing a deputy's badge. "Johnson, what the hell are you doing here? You're not on duty." The man Johnson shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Porter said he needed an official presence. Offered good money." Miller's expression darkened. "Get back to town," he ordered. "We'll discuss your future with the department later." As Johnson slunk away, Miller turned back to Charles. "Here's how this is going to work, Porter. You're going to mount up and ride back to town with me and my men. Then you're going to get on the next train east. If your wife wants to contact you, she knows where to find you." Charles's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. I have rights." "You have the right to leave my jurisdiction peacefully." Miller interrupted, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. "Or to be escorted out considerably less comfortably. Your choice." For a moment, Grace thought Charles might actually challenge the sheriff. Then calculation returned to his eyes. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered for now. But Charles Porter never admitted defeat. He merely retreated to fight another day. "This isn't over," he said, his gaze moving past Jackson to the cabin, as if he could see Grace watching through the window. "A man doesn't abandon what's his." "A woman isn't property," Margaret interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. "Neither is a child. The sooner you learn that, Mr. Porter, the less painful your education will be." Charles's eyes narrowed at the old woman, hatred flashing briefly before his political mask reasserted itself. "We'll see what the courts have to say about that." He turned to Edward, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. "Come, Fleming, we're returning to town." As they mounted their horses under the watchful eyes of the sheriff and his deputies, Charles's gaze returned to Jackson. "This isn't finished, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice pitched low but carrying clearly in the still air. "I protect what's mine. Always." Jackson didn't respond, his expression impassive as he watched the group depart down the trail, Miller and his deputies flanking Charles and Edward like prison guards with particularly troublesome inmates. Only when they had disappeared from view did Jackson lower his rifle, his shoulders relaxing infinitesimally. Margaret dismounted, approaching him with concern in her weathered face. "You all right?" she asked quietly. Jackson nodded once, though the tightness around his eyes suggested the confrontation had affected him more than he would admit. "Grace and the baby?" he asked, glancing toward the cabin. "Safe," Margaret assured him. "But this is only a reprieve, not a resolution. Porter isn't the type to surrender easily." "I know," Jackson acknowledged, his gaze returning to the trail where their visitors had vanished. "But neither am I." Inside the cabin, Grace cradled Hope close, her heart gradually slowing its frantic pace. She had watched the entire confrontation, had seen Jackson stand firm against Charles's threats and insinuations, had witnessed the unexpected arrival of allies when they needed them most. For the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future without constant fear, not because Charles had been permanently defeated, but because she was no longer facing him alone. When Jackson and Margaret entered the cabin, Grace met them with dry eyes and a steady gaze. "I heard everything," she said, her voice calmer than she felt. "What happens now?" Margaret settled her substantial frame into a chair by the fire, her expression grave but not defeated. "Porter will try legal means next," she predicted. "Writs court orders formal accusations against Jackson, perhaps even against me for aiding you." "But those take time," Jackson added, placing his rifle back in its rack by the door. in evidence, in willing witnesses, none of which he'll find easily in White Ridge, Margaret concluded with grim satisfaction. Not after the stories I've been sharing about his conduct in Philadelphia. Grace looked between them, these unlikely allies who had placed themselves between her and danger without hesitation. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for what she felt. Both of you. Margaret waved away her gratitude with a practical gesture. Save your thanks for when this is truly over, she advised. For now, focus on that little one. The stronger you both are, the better positioned you'll be for whatever comes next. As Margaret prepared to depart, promising to return the following day with news from town, she pulled Jackson aside for a private word. Grace couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the serious expressions, the way Jackson's jaw tightened at whatever Margaret was telling him. When they were alone again, Grace settled in the chair by the fire, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. Jackson moved about the cabin, restoring order after the tension of the morning, his movements containing a barely suppressed energy that suggested his calm exterior was more fragile than it appeared. What did Margaret say to you? Grace asked, finally breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Jackson paused in his work, his back to her for a long moment before he turned. She thinks Porter might not have come to Montana solely because of Edward's message, he said carefully. He may have had other reasons to head west. Grace frowned, not understanding. What other reasons? Jackson met her gaze directly. Me, he said simply. Porter served in the war. Different regiment, but same battle at Antietam. Margaret thinks he recognized my name. The implication slowly dawned on Grace. From the war. But why would that matter now after all these years? Jackson's expression grew distant, as if looking back across time to things he'd rather forget. I was a field surgeon, he said quietly. Saw things. Did things that stay with a man, including court-martial testimony against officers who abused their power. Understanding bloomed in Grace's mind. Charles was one of them. She breathed, pieces falling into place. That's why he seemed to know you, why he brought up Boston and your loss. Jackson nodded grimly. Captain Porter, he confirmed, ordered men to charge a fixed position. Suicide mission. When they refused, he shot one as an example. I treated the wounded man, heard his account before he died, testified at the inquiry. What happened? Grace asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Nothing, Jackson replied, bitterness edging his voice. Porter's father had political connections. Charges dismissed, incident buried. The dead man's family received a letter of condolence and a small pension. Grace closed her eyes briefly, pain lancing through her heart. This was the Charles she knew, the man behind the polished political facade, capable of casual cruelty and protected by privilege and connections. So when he saw you here with me, she began. Two birds, one stone, Jackson finished for her. Reclaim his wife and child, eliminate an old enemy. The cold calculation of it was so perfectly, terribly Charles that Grace felt physically ill. I'm sorry, she said softly. I've brought this danger to your door. Jackson shook his head, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair, his gaze level with hers. You have nothing to apologize for. He said, his voice low and intense. Nothing. Grace searched his face, finding only sincerity in his weathered features. Why are you helping us? She asked, the question that had lingered since that first night at the station finally finding voice. Why risk so much? Jackson was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to Hope's sleeping form and back again. Because it's right, he said finally. Because you deserve better than fear. Because... He hesitated as if the words were difficult to form. Because you and Hope brought something back to this cabin that I thought was gone forever. What? Grace whispered, though her heart already knew the answer. Life, he replied simply. Purpose. The word hung between them, laden with meaning, neither was quite ready to articulate fully. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, not from fear or pain, but from a complicated emotion she couldn't name, something that felt dangerously like hope. Jackson stood abruptly, as if embarrassed by his moment of openness. You should rest, he said, retreating behind his usual practicality. Both of you. Porter won't try anything else today, not with Miller watching him. Grace nodded, recognizing his need for distance after such vulnerability. And you, she asked. You haven't slept properly in days. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I've gone longer, he assured her, in army training, but I'll rest soon, I promise. As the afternoon waned into evening, a strange peace settled over the cabin. The immediate danger had passed, yet both Grace and Jackson knew it was merely a temporary reprieve. Charles would return perhaps with legal papers, perhaps with hired guns, perhaps alone, but he would come. And when he did, they would be ready, not just with rifles and allies, but with the strength that comes from knowing precisely what you're fighting for and why it matters enough to risk everything. Hope stirred in Grace's arms, tiny face scrunching, before relaxing again into sleep. Grace gazed down at her daughter, marveling at the perfect miniature features, the dark lashes against pink cheeks, the complete trust and dependency. In that moment, watching her child sleep in the warm sanctuary of Jackson's cabin, Grace made a silent vow. She would not run again. She would not hide. For Hope's sake, for her own, even for Jackson's, she would stand and fight for this fragile new beginning they had found together. Outside, the sun began its early winter descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Inside, Grace rocked gently in the chair by the fire, humming a lullaby her mother had once sung to her, while Jackson moved quietly about his evening chores, their shared silence comfortable in a way that needed no words. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together, the disgraced doctor, the fugitive wife, the newborn child. An unlikely family forged in crisis, bound not by blood or law, but by something perhaps stronger choice, the deliberate decision to stand together against whatever storms might come. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Grace found herself returning to the unfinished embroidery, fingers tracing the incomplete phrase her mother had begun, "Freedom comes." Now, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle and Jackson keeping watch nearby, Grace thought she might finally understand how that sentence was meant to end. Freedom came not from running, not from hiding, but from finding the courage to stand your ground alongside those who would stand with you. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, perhaps new dangers. But tonight in this cabin, warmed by fire and fragile hope, Grace allowed herself to believe in possibilities she had once thought forever beyond her reach. Safety, peace, and perhaps in time, something like love. Dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, Grace woke to the soft sounds of Hope's hungry fussing. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the quiet beauty of early morning, the warmth of the bed, the miracle of her daughter's presence. Then reality returned, the danger that still lurked beyond their door, the decisions that awaited them. Jackson was already up, stoking the fire to life, his movements quiet but purposeful. He glanced over as Grace sat up, offering a nod of acknowledgement before returning to his task. In the weeks since her arrival, she had come to understand his silences, to read the subtle shifts in his expression that spoke volumes to those who knew how to look. "Any news?" she asked, lifting Hope to nurse. "Not yet," Jackson replied, setting a pot of coffee on the stove. "Margaret will come when there's something to tell." They settled into their morning routine, Jackson preparing a simple breakfast, while Grace tended to Hope, the domestic rhythm, a stark contrast to the tension that hummed beneath the surface. Neither spoke of Charles Porter or the confrontation of the previous day, yet his presence haunted the edges of their consciousness like a shadow. After breakfast, Jackson donned his coat and hat. "Need to check the animals," he explained, pausing at the door. "Won't be far." Grace nodded, recognizing the unspoken message he would be within calling distance, watching alert to any approach. As the door closed behind him, she settled in the chair by the fire, hope cradled against her chest, and allowed herself to think beyond the immediate crisis. If when they survived Charles's attempts to reclaim her, what then would she stay here, in this remote cabin, with this solitary man who had risked everything to protect her? Would Jackson want that, or was his protection merely a temporary extension of his physician's oath to do no harm? The questions circled in her mind, unanswerable for now. Instead of dwelling on them, Grace turned her attention to practical matters. She gently laid Hope in her proto and retrieved her mother's sewing kit from her valise. The familiar rhythm of needle through fabric had always calmed her, given her space to think. She worked steadily, fashioning a small cap for Hope from scraps of the blue fabric Margaret had brought her, stitches tiny and precise. As she worked, she found herself humming softly a lullaby her mother had sung during long evenings in their Philadelphia kitchen. Two women bent over their sewing by lamplight. The memory brought both comfort and pain. Esther Sullivan had survived slavery, had built a life in business from nothing, had raised her daughter to be strong and skilled. What would she think of Grace now hiding in a remote cabin dependent on the protection of a man she barely knew? Would she approve of the choices Grace had made, the risks she had taken for freedom? You would understand, Grace whispered to the memory of her mother. You of all people would understand running toward freedom, whatever the pumped. The door opened, admitting Jackson and a gust of cold air. He stamped snow from his boots, hanging his coat by the door before moving to warm his hands by the fire. Storm coming, he reported, nodding toward the window where clouds were gathering on the horizon. Heavy one by the look of it. Grace followed his gaze, noting the darkening sky. Will it keep Charles away? She asked, voicing the question uppermost in both their minds. Jackson considered for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Maybe, for a day or two. He met her eyes directly. But it won't stop him permanently. Men like Porter don't give up easily. No, Grace agreed softly. They don't. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken concerns. Finally, Jackson spoke, his voice low and measured. We need to talk about what happens next, he said. About your options. Grace set aside her sewing, giving him her full attention. I'm listening. Jackson sat in the chair opposite her, his posture straight but not rigid, his hands resting on his knees. Margaret has connections, he began. People who help women in your situation. They could take you and Hope somewhere safe, California maybe, or even Canada, somewhere Porter couldn't find you. The suggestion hung in the air, reasonable and practical. A clean escape, a fresh start far from Charles's reach. Yet something in Jackson's tone, some barely perceptible note of reservation, caught Grace's attention. You don't think I should go, she observed, not a question, but a statement. Jackson's eyes met hers, something vulnerable flickering in their depths, before his usual reserve reasserted itself. Not my decision to make, he replied carefully. You need to do what's best for you and Hope. But you have an opinion, Grace pressed, suddenly needing to hear it articulated. Tell me. Jackson was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing his words with characteristic care. Running has cost, he said finally. I've seen it in the war in Boston here. People who run never stop looking over their shoulder, never feel completely safe. His gaze dropped to Hope, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. Children sense that fear, grow up shaped by it. Grace absorbed his words, recognizing the truth in them. Hadn't she felt exactly that these past months, the constant vigilance, the nagging dread, the inability to fully inhabit any moment without fear of discovery? What's the alternative? She asked quietly. Charles won't simply disappear. He has resources, connections, legal rights as my husband and Hope's father. Yes, Jackson acknowledged, but he also has vulnerabilities, secrets, things a man in his position can't afford to have exposed. Understanding dawned slowly. You mean his war record, the court-martial? Jackson nodded. That and whatever else he's hiding. Men like Porter, men who hurt women, who abuse power, rarely limit their cruelty to one area of life. You're suggesting we find leverage. Grace said, the concept both foreign and strangely appealing. Something to make him back away permanently. It's an option, Jackson confirmed. Not without risk, but perhaps less costly in the long run than a lifetime of looking over your shoulder. Grace considered this, her mind turning over the implications. To confront Charles rather than flee him, to fight with knowledge rather than simply escape, it was a strategy she had never contemplated before. How would we even begin, she asked. Charles is careful. His public reputation is everything to him. A hint of something almost like satisfaction crossed Jackson's face. Which makes it his greatest vulnerability, he pointed out, and we have advantages he doesn't. Local allies, time to prepare, knowledge of his past that he believes is buried. Outside, the first snowflakes of the approaching storm began to fall, delicate crystals dancing on the wind. Inside, something shifted in Grace's heart, fear giving way to a steely determination she hadn't known she possessed. If we do this, she said slowly, if we stand against him instead of running, there's no guarantee we'll succeed. Charles is powerful, vindictive. He could destroy us both. Yes, Jackson agreed, simply no false reassurance in his tone. He could. Then why risk it? Grace asked, needing to hear his reasoning, to understand what motivated this taciturn man to place himself in harm's way for her and Hope. Jackson's gaze held hers, unwavering. Because some things are worth fighting for, he said quietly. Some principles matter more than safety. The simple statement hung between them profound in its clarity. This was not the flowery declaration of a romantic hero, but the considered philosophy of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in standing for what was right. I need time, Grace said finally, to think about this, to be certain. Jackson nodded, rising from his chair. Take it, he replied. No decision needs to be made today. As he moved away to attend to his own tasks, Grace watched him, this enigmatic man who had opened his home and risked his hard-won peace to shelter her. Whatever she decided, she realized would affect not just her and Hope, but Jackson as well. Their lives had become intertwined in ways none of them could have anticipated. The snow fell more heavily now, transforming the landscape into a realm of white. Grace lifted Hope from her cradle, cradling the infant close as she gazed out at the swirling flakes. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. How they weathered it would determine not just their safety, but the kind of life Hope would know, the legacy Grace would leave for her daughter. "What would you do, little one?" she whispered, brushing a finger against Hope's soft cheek. "Run towards safety or stand for truth?" Hope's only answer was a sleepy yawn, tiny fingers curling around her mother's thumb with surprising strength. Looking down at that perfect face, Grace felt something crystallize within her, a certainty that transcended fear. She had run from Philadelphia seeking safety. She had followed Edward Fleming seeking belonging. Now perhaps it was time to stand her ground, not just for herself, but for her daughter, for the future they both deserved. The decision once made brought an unexpected sense of peace. Grace settled back in her chair, Hope nestled securely in her arms, and began to plan. The storm arrived with full force by mid-afternoon, wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls, snow piling in drifts that soon obscured the windows. Inside, the three occupants existed in a bubble of warmth and relative safety, isolated from the outside world by nature's fury. Jackson kept the fire well fed, occasionally venturing out to check on the animals, or bring in more wood, returning with snow, crusting his beard and eyebrows. Grace prepared meals, tended to Hope, and continued her sewing projects, the domestic routine a counterpoint to the wild elements outside. As evening approached, Jackson sat at his desk, writing in what appeared to be a journal, his expression intent. Grace, curious, approached with Hope in her arms. "What are you working on?" she asked. Jackson glanced up, hesitating briefly before answering. "Evidence," he said, turning the journal so she could see. "Everything I remember about Porter from the war. Dates, locations, witnesses who might still be alive." Grace studied the neat, precise handwriting, the methodical organization of facts and observations. "You think this will be enough to make him back down?" "Not alone," Jackson admitted, "but it's a start, especially if we can find corroborating testimony." Grace settled in the chair beside his desk, adjusting Hope against her shoulder. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about running versus standing our ground." Jackson set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "I don't want to run anymore," she continued, the words gathering strength as she spoke them aloud. "I don't want Hope to grow up looking over her shoulder, never feeling safe. I want to end this, truly end it, not just escape temporarily." Something like approval flickered in Jackson's eyes, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "It won't be easy," he cautioned. "Porter has resources, connections." "So do we," Grace countered, surprising herself with her confidence. "Margaret Sheriff Miller, perhaps others who know the truth about Charles's past." She hesitated, then added more softly, "And we have each other." The last words hung between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to articulate fully. Jackson's gaze held hers for a long moment, before he nodded a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, unexpected yet undeniable. "If we do this," he said finally, "we need to be thorough, gather every piece of evidence, anticipate every move Porter might make." "Then let's begin," Grace replied simply. They spent the evening strategizing, Jackson sharing what he remembered from the war, Grace detailing the patterns of Charles's abuse, the witnesses in Philadelphia who might be persuaded to speak if approached correctly. They identified weaknesses in Charles's carefully constructed public image, points of leverage that might be exploited. The work was both painful and liberating, revisiting old wounds yet transforming them from sources of shame into potential weapons. By the time they retired for the night, a plan had begun to take shape, still rough but promising. Morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, it had intensified overnight, the world beyond the cabin's walls a chaotic swirl of white. No visitors would reach them today. They both knew neither allies nor enemies could navigate such conditions. After breakfast, Grace made a decision. Retrieving her mother's unfinished embroidery from her valise, she settled by the fire and began to stitch, completing the phrase her mother had begun, "Freedom comes when you stand your ground." Jackson, noticing her work, approached quietly. "Your mother's words?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "Mine," she replied, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. "But I think she would approve." A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. "I think she would too." The day passed in quiet industry, the storm providing an unexpected reprieve from immediate concerns. Grace nursed hope, sewed, and helped Jackson organize his notes into a more coherent narrative. Jackson chopped more wood, tended the animals in the lean-to, and worked on a small wooden toy for Hope, a carved bird with wings that moved when pulled by a string. It was almost possible in these peaceful domestic moments to forget the danger that awaited them once the storm cleared. Almost, but not quite. The knowledge hummed beneath every interaction, every shared glance, that this was temporary, that decisions made now would shape all their futures. As dusk approached on the second day of the storm, the wind finally began to abate, the snowfall thinning to occasional flakes. Jackson stood at the window watching as stars appeared in breaks between the clouds. "Storm's passing," he observed. "Roads should be passable by tomorrow afternoon." Grace nodded, understanding the implications. Their isolation was ending. The world, with all its complications and dangers, would soon intrude once more. "Are you afraid?" Jackson asked, the directness of the question unusual for him. Grace considered before answering, her hand resting protectively on Hope's cradle. "Yes," she admitted, "but not like before. This is different, cleaner somehow." Jackson seemed to understand, nodding slightly. "Fear of the known is different from fear of the unknown," he said. "You can prepare for what you can name." "Exactly," Grace agreed, struck once again by this man's capacity to articulate complex emotions with simple clarity. "And I'm not alone this time." Something softened in Jackson's weathered face. "No," he confirmed quietly. "You are not." The moment stretched between them waited with unspoken feelings. Then Hope stirred in her cradle, breaking the spell. Grace rose to attend to her daughter, and Jackson returned to his preparations, each acutely aware of the other's presence, of the fragile connection forming between them. Morning arrived, clear and cold sunlight glinting off pristine snow, the world transformed into a glittering wonderland. Jackson ventured out early to clear paths to the animals' shelter and woodpile, the physical labor a release for the tension that had built during their confinement. Grace watched from the window, Hope in her arms, as he worked methodically, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. There was something reassuring about his steady presence, his quiet competence. Whatever came next, she knew with growing certainty that this man would stand beside her, not because of obligation or pity, but because of the principles that guided his life. By mid-morning, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Jackson straightened from his work, one hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt as he scanned the trail. His posture relaxed slightly as he recognized the riders Margaret Fletcher, accompanied by Sheriff Miller, and Thomas Running Elk. Grace stepped onto the porch as they approached Hope, bundled warmly against her chest. The visitors dismounted, stamping snow from their boots before joining them. "Quite a storm," Margaret commented, unwinding her scarf. "Thought you might need checking on." "We're fine," Grace assured her, stepping aside to let them enter the cabin. "The baby's well, and we had plenty of supplies." Inside, over coffee that Jackson prepared, Sheriff Miller shared the news from town. "Porter's still at the hotel," he reported. "Been sending telegrams east, receiving responses. Got a lawyer with him now, arrived on yesterday's train once the tracks were cleared." "What kind of lawyer?" Jackson asked, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. "The expensive kind," Miller replied dryly. "Brooks is his name. Specializes in family law, from what I gather." Grace's stomach tightened, though she had expected this development. Charles would use every legal means at his disposal before resorting to more direct measures. "He's filing for custody of the child," Margaret added, her weathered face solemn. "And for your return to the marital home, Grace, on grounds of abandonment and moral impropriety." The accusations stung, though they were predictable. Charles would paint her as unstable, unfit, a woman who had abandoned her husband living unchaperoned with a strange man in the wilderness. In the eyes of the law, his claims would carry weight. What does that mean for us practically? Grace asked, forcing herself to focus on facts rather than emotion. Court order most likely, Miller explained, requiring you to appear before a judge in White Ridge with the child. Porter's lawyer is pushing for it to happen immediately. Jackson set down his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. And if Grace refuses to appear, Miller's gaze was direct. Then I'd be obligated to enforce the order. Bring her and the child to town by force if necessary. He held up a hand to forestall objection. I'm not saying I would mind you, just explaining the legal position. Thomas Running Elk, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. There is another way, he said, his voice quiet but carrying authority. My people have helped women in similar situations before. We could take Grace and the child to the reservation. Porter's legal papers would have no power there. It was a tempting suggestion, immediate safety removal from Charles's reach. Yet Grace found herself hesitating, looking to Jackson, whose expression remained carefully neutral. Thank you, she said to Thomas, genuine gratitude in her voice. But I don't think running is the answer anymore. Margaret's sharp eyes moved between Grace and Jackson. You have a plan, she observed, not a question, but a statement. The beginnings of one, Jackson confirmed. But we need more information about Porter's time in the war specifically. Sheriff Miller leaned forward, interest piqued. What kind of information? Jackson outlined what they knew Charles's role in as a captain, the court-martial proceedings, the dead soldier whose testimony Jackson had heard. There would be records, he concluded, military archives, witnesses perhaps still living. That takes time, Miller pointed out. Time you may not have if a court order comes through. Unless, Margaret interjected thoughtfully, the judge in question were sympathetic to Grace's situation. Judge Wilson is no friend to men who mistreat women. His own sister suffered a similar fate. A spark of hope kindled in Grace's chest. Could he delay the proceedings? Give us time to gather evidence. Possibly, Miller acknowledged, especially if there were concerns about the child's welfare during winter travel. A new mother and infant forced to make the journey to town in these conditions might be deemed unsafe. The group fell silent, each considering the implications. Finally, Thomas spoke again, his gaze moving to the window where snow still blanketed the landscape. I can help with the evidence, he offered. My brother served in the Union Army, same battle as you mentioned. He might know of others who witnessed this Captain Porter's actions. Jackson nodded, gratitude evident in his expression. That would be invaluable. And I'll speak with Judge Wilson, Margaret added, privately before Porter's lawyer can get to him. A sympathetic ear from the start could make all the difference. As their visitors prepared to depart, each with tasks assigned for their makeshift alliance, Sheriff Miller pulled Jackson aside for a private word. Grace couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the gravity in both men's expressions, the slight nod Jackson gave in response to whatever Miller had said. When they were alone again, Grace turned to Jackson, question in her eyes. Miller thinks Porter might not wait for legal processes to play out, he explained, hanging his coat by the door. Says he's been asking about hiring men not just for protection, but for action. A chill ran through Grace that had nothing to do with the winter cold. He's planning to take hope by force, she realized aloud. Jackson nodded grimly. It's what I would expect from him, based on what I saw during the war. When legitimate authority doesn't give him what he wants, he creates his own authority. What do we do? Grace asked, clutching hope closer. Jackson's expression, hardened determination, etched in every line of his weathered face. We prepare, he said simply, for all possibilities. The afternoon passed in practical preparations. Jackson checked and cleaned his rifle-positioned lanterns for maximum visibility around the cabin's perimeter and cleared sightlines through the surrounding trees. Grace, for her part, packed essentials for Hope diapers, extra clothing, the blue cap she had sewn items that could be grabbed quickly if they needed to flee. As dusk approached, bringing with it the early darkness of winter, Jackson built up the fire and lit extra lanterns. The cabin glowed with warmth and light, a beacon in the gathering gloom. Outside, the temperature dropped rapidly, stars appearing in a crystal-clear sky. Cold night, Jackson observed, returning from a final check of the animals. Too cold for most men to be out causing trouble. Grace nodded, though she wasn't entirely reassured. Charles Porter wasn't most men. His determination, his need for control, might well override practical considerations like weather. They ate a simple dinner, the atmosphere charged with anticipation despite their efforts at normalcy. Afterward, Jackson surprised Grace by retrieving the checkerboard they had played with during her first days at the cabin. Might help pass the time, he suggested, setting it on the table between them. Grace recognized the gesture for what it was, an attempt to provide distraction to create a pocket of ordinary life amidst extraordinary circumstances. She smiled, grateful for his understanding. They played 2 games, conversations sparse but comfortable. Grace won the first, Jackson the second. As he put away the board, Grace noticed that, despite his outward calm, his gaze frequently moved to the window, scanning the darkness beyond. "You should rest," he told her, nodding toward the bed. "I'll keep watch." Grace hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone with the burden of vigilance. "Wake me in a few hours," she insisted. "You need rest too." Jackson looked as if he might argue, then nodded once in acquiescence. 4 hours, he agreed. "Then we'll switch." Grace settled onto the bed, hope in her cradle nearby, but sleep proved elusive despite her exhaustion. Her mind raced with contingencies, fears, plans half-formed, and immediately discarded. Through half-closed eyes, she watched Jackson's silhouette by the window, solid and reassuring. How strange, she thought drowsily, that she should feel safer here, under direct threat, than she had in her grand Philadelphia home with all its locks and servants. Yet it was true. With Jackson, she felt protected, not by walls or wealth, but by something far more reliable: integrity, courage, the simple determination to do what was right. Sleep claimed her, eventually deep and dreamless. She woke to Jackson's gentle touch on her shoulder. The cabin still dark, the fire burning low. "My turn?" she asked, sitting up quickly. Jackson nodded, his expression betraying his own fatigue. "All quiet so far," he reported, "but stay alert. Dawn's the most likely time for trouble." Grace took his place by the window, rifle propped nearby, as he had shown her how to use during their preparations. Jackson stretched out on the bed, not bothering to remove his boots, one arm flung across his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. The night stretched on, silent and cold. Grace divided her attention between the darkness outside and the 2 sleeping figures inside, Hope, in her cradle, Jackson, on the bed. This unlikely family they had formed, bound by circumstance and choice rather than blood or law. Family. The words settled in her mind, unexpected yet fitting. Was that what they were becoming? What they could be if they survived the immediate danger? The possibility both frightened and exhilarated her. The first hint of dawn appeared as a faint lightening of the eastern sky, stars fading one by one. Grace tensed, remembering Jackson's warning about this being the most vulnerable time. She scanned the tree line, the path leading to the cabin, alert for any movement. There, a shadow moving between the pines, too deliberate to be an animal. Then another and a third, men approaching stealthily, using the trees for cover. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she moved quickly to Jackson's side. "They're here," she whispered, touching his shoulder. Jackson was instantly awake, rolling to his feet in one fluid motion. He joined her at the window, eyes narrowing as he spotted the approaching figures. "At least 3, he murmured. "Maybe more further back." He turned to Grace, his expression grave but calm. "Get Hope. Stay low, away from the windows." As Grace gathered her sleeping daughter, Jackson moved with quiet efficiency, checking his rifle before positioning himself by the door. "If shooting starts," he instructed, "take Hope to the root cellar. Trapdoors under the rug by the pantry. Stay there until I come for you or until you hear Margaret's voice." Grace nodded, clutching Hope close as she crouched behind the solid oak table Jackson had overturned as a barricade. Fear tightened her throat, but beneath it ran a current of fierce determination. She would not let Charles take her child, would not return to the prison of her marriage. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, there was no going back. Outside, the approaching men had reached the edge of the clearing, still using the trees for cover. Jackson peered through a narrow gap in the curtains, his expression hardening. "Porter's with them," he reported quietly, "and Edward Fleming. 3 others hired guns by the look of them." Grace's breath caught. "What will they do?" Jackson's gaze remained fixed on the scene outside. "Try to intimidate first," he predicted. "Porter won't want to start shooting if he can avoid it. Too messy, too many potential witnesses later. He'll want this to look legitimate, like he's simply reclaiming his wife and child." As if on cue, Charles's voice carried across the clearing, controlled but carrying a hint of his characteristic arrogance. "Adreed, I know you're in there. I've come for my wife and child. Send them out, and there need be no unpleasantness. Jackson didn't respond, his expression calculating as he assessed the positions of the men outside. "Reed," Charles called, again impatience edging his tone. "Be reasonable. You're harboring my legal wife against her will. The law is on my side." Still Jackson remained silent, watching, waiting. Grace understood his strategy forced Charles to make the first move to reveal his true intentions. After several minutes of tense silence, one of the hired men muttered something to Charles, who nodded sharply. Two of the men began to circle toward the back of the cabin, while Charles, Edward, and the third man approached the front door more directly. "Last chance, Reed," Charles called, his voice harder now. "Send them out or we're coming in." Jackson finally responded, his voice calm and caring. "They're not yours to claim, Porter. Grace has made her choice. The child is under her protection." Charles's laugh was cold, disbelieving. "Choice, a wife doesn't get to choose to abandon her husband, and a child belongs with its father. These are laws, Reed, not suggestions." "Some laws," Jackson replied steadily, "protect the powerful, not the innocent." A tense silence followed this exchange. Then, without warning, a shot rang out, not aimed at the cabin, but fired into the air, a signal or warning. "That's how you want to play this," Charles called, anger now evident in his voice. "Fine. We do this the hard way." The next moments unfolded in a blur of action. The back door splintered under the force of an axe, one of the hired men attempting to break through. Simultaneously, Charles and his companions rushed the front door. Jackson fired a warning shot over their heads, causing them to duck for cover. "Stay down," he shouted to Grace, moving to address the breach at the back door. Grace clutched Hope, who had awakened and begun to cry at the commotion. "Shh, little one," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "It's all right, we're safe." But they weren't safe, not with men breaking down their doors, not with Charles Porter's determination driving the assault. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. Then Hope's tiny hand curled around her finger, a reminder of what was at stake, of why she had chosen to stand rather than run. The back door gave way with a crash. Jackson fired again, and a man's cry of pain indicated he had found his mark. At the front, Charles and his men were preparing for another rush. "Grace," Jackson called urgently. "The cellar. Now." She rose to obey, keeping low as she made her way toward the trap door Jackson had indicated. Before she could reach it, the front door burst open, admitting Charles, Edward, and the third man, who held a pistol trained on Jackson. "Don't move, Reed," Charles ordered, his own weapon drawn, "or Jenkins here will put a bullet in you." Jackson froze, his rifle half raised, assessing the situation with clinical detachment. In the moment of stillness that followed, Charles's gaze found Grace crouched against the far wall with Hope clutched protectively to her chest. "Grace," he said, his tone modulating to something almost gentle, though his eyes remained cold. "It's time to come home. This adventure has gone on long enough." Grace straightened slowly, her chin lifting in defiance despite the fear churning in her stomach. "This isn't an adventure, Charles," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's an escape. From you, from your cruelty, from the prison you made of our marriage." Charles's expression hardened, the political mask slipping to reveal the rage beneath. "Careful, my dear," he warned. "You're overwrought, clearly not thinking clearly. The birth distress, it's understandable. But it's time to remember your place." "My place," Grace repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. "Which is where Charles, under your fist, hiding bruises beneath high collars, apologizing for displeasing you in ways I never understood." Edward shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Charles and Grace. The hired gun Jenkins maintained his aim at Jackson, though his expression suggested he hadn't bargained for a domestic dispute. "This is tedious," Charles snapped, patience evaporating. "Give me the child, Grace. Now we can discuss your concerns on the journey home." "No," Grace said simply, the single word containing all her accumulated courage, all her determination to break free from his control. Rage flashed across Charles's face, the mask dropping completely. "You don't have a choice," he snarled, taking a step toward her. "That child is mine. You are mine. Everything you have, everything you are, belongs to me under the law." "The law," Jackson interjected, drawing Charles's attention back to him, "doesn't permit a man to beat his wife, to terrorize her, to treat her as property rather than a person." Charles's laugh was ugly, dismissive. The law, he countered, concerns itself with public matters, not private ones. What happens between a man and his wife is their business, not the state's. Is that what you told yourself? Jackson asked, his tone conversational, despite the tension vibrating through the cabin. That it was private justified, just like it was justified to order those men to their deaths at Antietam to shoot Private Williams when he questioned your orders. The color drained from Charles's face, shock replacing anger. How tall? He began, then caught himself. I don't know what you're talking about. You do. Jackson pressed his gaze unwavering. September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day of the war. You ordered Company B to charge a fortified Confederate position. When they hesitated recognizing it as suicide, you shot Private Thomas Williams as an example to the others. Edward looked bewildered, glancing between Charles and Jackson with growing unease. Jenkins's gun hand wavered slightly, his attention divided by the unexpected turn of the conversation. Lies, Charles hissed, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. Ancient history irrelevant. Not to Williams's family, Jackson countered. Not to the men who died following your orders. Not to the Army inquiry that was mysteriously discontinued after your father made certain arrangements. Charles's expression shifted, calculation replacing denial. Even if that were true, he said carefully, it's your word against mine. A disgraced doctor hiding in the mountains versus a respected state representative. Who do you think people will believe? Not just his word, a new voice interrupted from the doorway. All heads turned to find Sheriff Miller standing there, flanked by two deputies with rifles raised. Behind them stood Margaret Fletcher, and to Grace's surprise, Thomas Running Elk, accompanied by an elderly white man in a Union Army veteran's coat. Colonel James Harrington, Miller introduced the stranger. Retired now, but during the war he presided over the initial inquiry into Captain Porter's actions at Antietam. He's got quite a story to tell, one he's been waiting to share for years. Charles's face contorted with rage and disbelief. This is absurd, he sputtered. A conspiracy to slander me to interfere in a private family matter. Nothing private about murder, Porter, Miller replied evenly, or about threatening people at gunpoint in my jurisdiction. He nodded to his deputies. Disarm them. For a moment it seemed Charles might resist. His finger tightened on the trigger of his pistol, his gaze darting between Jackson, Grace, and the newcomers, calculating odds, weighing options. Don't, Jackson advised quietly. Not in front of your child. Something in those words, the simple truth of them perhaps, or the realization of how this scene would appear to others, seemed to penetrate Charles's rage. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, the fight draining from him as he recognized his position was untenable. The deputies moved forward, taking weapons from Charles Edward and the reluctant Jenkins. Outside, the sound of horses suggested the second hired man had decided discretion was the better part of valor and fled. Charles Porter, Miller said formally, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. He paused, glancing at Colonel Harrington. And there may be additional charges forthcoming once all the facts about your military service are established. As the deputies led Charles and his companions outside, Margaret hurried to Grace's side, her weathered face creased with concern. Are you all right? She asked, examining both Grace and Hope with experienced eyes. The baby? We're fine, Grace assured her, though her voice trembled with reaction now that the immediate danger had passed. How did you know to come? Thomas, Margaret explained, nodding toward the Blackfoot scout who stood conversing quietly with Jackson and Colonel Harrington. He spotted Porter and his men heading this way at dawn, rode to town to warn us. Grace looked across the room to where Jackson now stood, relief visible in the slight easing of his rigid posture. Their eyes met, a world of unspoken communication passing between them. Gratitude, relief, the shared knowledge that they had stood together and prevailed. Colonel Harrington approached Grace, his bearing military, despite his advanced years. Mrs. Porter, he began, then corrected himself. Or would you prefer Sullivan? Sullivan, Grace confirmed the choice, feeling right, a reclaiming of her mother's name and legacy. Harrington nodded respectfully. Miss Sullivan, then, I want you to know that your husband Porter will face justice not just for today's actions, but for crimes long buried. I've carried the weight of that incomplete inquiry for years, unable to pursue it due to political interference. Now finally the truth will be heard. Thank you, Grace said simply, understanding what this meant not just for her immediate safety, but for her future freedom. With Charles facing military and civilian charges, his ability to control her life would be severely curtailed, perhaps eliminated entirely. As the cabin emptied, Sheriff Miller pausing only to assure them he would return later for formal statements, Grace found herself alone with Jackson. Marguerite, having taken Hope outside briefly to check her more thoroughly in better light. For a moment, neither spoke the reality of what had just occurred, what they had survived together, too overwhelming for immediate articulation. Then Jackson crossed the room in 3 long strides and with uncharacteristic impulsiveness, pulled Grace into a tight embrace. She stiffened momentarily in surprise, then melted against him, arms encircling his waist, face pressed against the solid warmth of his chest. They stood thus for several heartbeats, 2 survivors clinging to the knowledge that they had faced the worst and emerged intact. When they finally separated, Jackson's expression held an openness, a vulnerability Grace had rarely glimpsed in his weathered features. "I thought," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "When they broke in, when Porter had that gun, I thought I might fail. Again, like with Sarah and Emma." Grace reached up, her hand gentle against his bearded cheek. "But you didn't fail," she said softly. "You protected us. You stood your ground." Something shifted in Jackson's eyes, a shadow lifting a wound if not healed, then at least acknowledged, exposed to light and air rather than festering in darkness. "We stood our ground," he corrected, catching her hand in his, holding it as if it were something precious. The moment stretched between them, waited with possibility. Then Margaret's voice called from outside, and they stepped apart, the spell broken, but not forgotten. The day that followed was a blur of activity statements given to Sheriff Miller, visits from townspeople curious about the morning's excitement, Colonel Harrington sharing his recollections of the war, and the inquiry that had been suppressed. Through it all, Grace moved in a state of stunned relief, the reality of their narrow escape of Charles's arrest still settling into her consciousness. By evening, when the cabin was finally quiet again, Grace sat by the fire with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle. Jackson moved about the space, repairing the damaged doors as best he could, his movements containing the restless energy of a man still processing danger and deliverance. "What happens now?" Grace asked, finally voicing the question that had hovered between them all day. Jackson paused in his work, turning to face her. "Porter will stand trial," he said, "first for today's actions, then potentially for the military charges if Harrington's evidence is deemed sufficient." "And us," Grace pressed, needing to hear his thoughts, his intentions. Jackson was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "That," he said finally, "depends on what you want." Grace considered the question, all its implications and possibilities. What did she want? Safety, certainly. Freedom from fear. A place to raise hope and peace. But beyond those basic needs, what did she truly desire for her future? "I want to stay," she said simply, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised her. "Here with you, if that's what you want too." Jackson's expression softened, vulnerability and hope visible in his usually guarded features. "It is," he confirmed quietly, "more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." The admission hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Not a declaration of undying love, not a promise of forever, but something perhaps more valuable, and an honest acknowledgement of choice, of desire, of possibility. "It won't be easy," Jackson cautioned, ever practical. "This life is hard, especially in winter. The cabin's small resources limited." Grace smiled, seeing through his warnings to the fear beneath, not of hardship, but of hope, of allowing himself to believe in a future after so much loss. "I know," she assured him, "but I've learned that safety isn't found in grand houses or comfortable surroundings. It's found in people who stand beside you when storms come, who see your worth beyond what you can provide or produce." Jackson crossed the room, slowly settling in the chair opposite hers. "And you've found that here?" he asked, a rare uncertainty in his voice. "I have," Grace confirmed, holding his gaze steadily. "With you." Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a weight lifting and a door opening. He reached across the space between them, offering his hand, palm up, not demanding, not presuming, but inviting. Grace placed her hand in his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture as intimate as any embrace. Outside, stars emerged in the clear winter sky, distant and eternal. Inside, two damaged people who had found in each other not just safety, but understanding, not just shelter, but home, bed in companionable silence watching the fire burn low. Tomorrow, Jackson said, eventually his voice soft in the quiet cabin. We should talk about additions to the cabin. A proper room for Hope as she grows. Perhaps a workshop for your sewing. The casual mention of a shared future of plans beyond the immediate crisis warmed Grace more than the fire ever could. I'd like that, she replied simply. Later, as she settled Hope for the night, Grace found herself returning to her mother's embroidery, now completed with her own addition. Freedom comes when you stand your ground. Running her fingers over the stitches, she thought of all the ground she had covered to reach this point, from Philadelphia to Montana, from fear to courage, from isolation to connection. The journey had been long, the cost high, but looking at Hope's peaceful face and Jackson's solid presence across the room, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she had finally found her true north, her place to stand. Outside, the Montana winter stretched vast and challenging. Inside the cabin on Pine Ridge, a family forged in crisis and choice rather than blood or law faced the future together, their bonds stronger, for having been tested, their love deeper, for having been chosen rather than merely inherited or assumed. And in that choice to stay, to build, to begin again, Grace Sullivan found not just safety, but the freedom her mother had always wished for her, the freedom to live fully, to love deeply, and to stand her ground in a world that had tried to render her powerless. As Hope slept and Jackson worked, and the fire burned steadily in the hearth, Grace allowed herself to believe in the promise of winter, that beneath the snow and cold lay seeds of new life, waiting patiently for their season to bloom.